From the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn's Marcy Houses to champagne boardrooms in Paris and Silicon Valley deals, this is the rise of Shawn Carter, the man the world calls Jay-Z. A hustler who turned rejection into an empire, an artist who built his own label when no one would sign him, a mogul who learned that ownership was the ultimate verse. He sold records, then sold luxury. He mastered music, then mastered money. And somewhere between the corner and the corner office, he became hip-hop's first billionaire. Tonight, discover how Jay-Z rewrote the rules of success and prove that wealth isn't about money, it's about freedom. Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. The December air bit through the thin walls of apartment 6J in Brooklyn's Marcy Houses. Gloria Carter cradled her newborn son, Shawn Corey Carter, later to be known as Jay-Z, born just hours earlier on December 4th, 1969. Outside, the concrete towers of the housing project stood like sentinels against a grey winter sky, while inside, a small space heater battled the persistent chill. "He has your eyes," Gloria whispered to Adnis Reeves, who gazed down at his son with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. The Vietnam War raged overseas. Nixon had taken office earlier that year, and in Bedford-Stuyvesant, the economic decline that would define the next decade was already setting in. Gloria traced her finger along Shawn's tiny cheek. She worked as a clerk at an investment firm, watching daily as men in expensive suits moved money that could transform neighborhoods like hers. She understood numbers, systems, and the way the world worked beyond Marty's boundaries. "He'll need to be strong," Adnis said, his voice low. The young father knew the statistics for boys born in places like this. The odds weren't favorable. "He'll be more than strong," Gloria answered. "He'll be smart." As Shawn grew from infant to toddler, the 1970s unfurled around him like a tattered flag. The 16 towers of Marcy Houses became his universe, a concrete archipelago rising from streets where abandoned buildings stood with plywood windows and graffiti-marked walls. The scent of his mother's cooking mingled with the ever-present smells of the city. Garbage awaiting collection, the grease from corner chicken spots, the occasional sweet haze of marijuana drifting down stairwells. By 1975, when Shawn was 6, New York City teetered on bankruptcy. The Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead," captured the federal government's response to the fiscal crisis. In Marcy, such political dramas registered only in the practical consequences: fewer police patrols, less frequent garbage collection, more frequent power outages. Shawn's childhood playground was the asphalt between buildings, where older boys played basketball, and where, on summer evenings, extension cords snaked from apartment windows to power speakers for block parties. The soundtrack of his early years was the transition from soul and funk to the earliest iterations of hip-hop. The Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, spreading through the neighborhood in 1979 like an electric current. "Stay close to your brother," Gloria would tell him, as Eric, older by several years, led Shawn through the labyrinth of Marcy. Eric had already developed the harder shell required for survival, while Shawn observed everything with quiet intensity, his memory capturing details others missed. At home, Gloria maintained order with firm expectations and unwavering support. She worked long hours but made time to check homework to ensure her children understood that education was non-negotiable. The apartment was modest but meticulously kept, a counterpoint to the chaos outside. When Shawn was 11, the delicate equilibrium of their household fractured. Adnis Reeves walked out, leaving Gloria to raise 4 children alone. The official explanation was simple: he left. But the emotional aftermath was complex. Why'd he go? Shawn asked his mother one evening, finding her at the kitchen table with bills spread before her like a complicated puzzle. Gloria looked up, her face composed despite the new lines of worry around her eyes. "Sometimes people break in ways we can't fix, Shawn. But we don't break, we figure it out." In the vacuum left by his father's departure, Shawn's relationship with his older brother Eric intensified. Eric became both protector and antagonist, the person who showed Shawn how to navigate Marcy's unwritten rules and the one who tested whether those lessons had been absorbed. The early 1980s brought Ronald Reagan to the White House and a new economic philosophy that never trickled down to places like Bed-Stuy. What did arrive, with devastating efficiency, was crack cocaine. The drug transformed the ecosystem of urban neighborhoods, creating a shadow economy with its own brutal logic. Shawn, now approaching his teenage years, absorbed these changes with the same quiet attention he'd always possessed. He watched older boys work corners, noted the mechanics of their operations, who stood where, how money changed hands, the calculation of risk and reward. He didn't simply see, he analyzed. At George Westinghouse High School, Shawn found himself drawn to words. In cafeterias and hallways, students gathered for freestyle battles, verbal chess matches where quick thinking and sharper delivery determined the winner. Here was another ecosystem with its own rules, one where Shawn's observational skills and memory gave him an edge. He rarely wrote down his rhymes, instead developing a technique of composing and memorizing verses entirely in his head. This wasn't merely stylistic preference, but practical necessity. Notebooks could be lost, stolen, or become evidence. The mind was the safest vault. During summers, Shawn sometimes stayed with relatives in Trenton, New Jersey, where he honed his skills in the more competitive arena of that city's battle scene. At Trenton Central High School, where the stakes were higher and the opponents more seasoned, he learned composure under pressure, how to absorb a verbal attack without visibly reacting, how to turn an opponent's momentum against them. But it was an incident in 1982, when Shawn was 13, that crystallized something fundamental in his character. He had taken some of Eric's jewelry, an impulsive act, perhaps testing boundaries, perhaps simply attracted to something that glittered with promise beyond Marcy's confines. Eric's reaction was swift and extreme. In a moment of rage, he shot his younger brother in the shoulder. The physical pain was intense, but finite. More lasting was the moral architecture that took shape in the aftermath. When questioned about the injury, Shawn maintained an impenetrable silence. He wouldn't identify his brother as the shooter, wouldn't elaborate on circumstances. The code was clear. You handle your own situations, you protect family, and above all, you never involve authorities. As Shawn recovered, lying on the same bed where he'd spent countless hours staring at the ceiling and composing rhymes in his head, Gloria sat beside him. "You understand what happened was wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Shawn replied. "And you understand why you're not telling anyone who did it?" "Yes, I understand." Gloria studied her son's face, noting the hardness that hadn't been there before. There's a difference between loyalty and foolishness, between handling something yourself and destroying yourself. You're going to need to know that difference. The incident marked Shawn in ways both visible and invisible. The physical scar became a permanent reminder of consequences, while the psychological impact reinforced lessons about loyalty, self-reliance, and the complex moral calculations required in environments where official systems of justice often failed to serve. By 1984, at 15, Shawn had transferred to Eli Whitney High School after struggling academically at Westinghouse. The educational institutions themselves seemed almost incidental to his real education, which was taking place in the streets, in battle cyphers, and in the quiet hours when he analyzed everything he'd observed. He was developing what would later become his defining approach to both art and business, an ownership mindset. Even without possessions or position, he understood that the first thing you must own is yourself, your talent, your narrative, your response to circumstances. One autumn evening, as dusk settled over Marcy, Shawn stood on the rooftop of his building. Below, the project sprawled like a scale model of the larger world, its economies, hierarchies, and unwritten constitutions. The lights of Manhattan glittered in the distance, a topography of wealth that seemed both impossibly remote and tantalizingly within reach. A door opened behind him, and Gloria stepped onto the roof. She moved to stand beside her son, following his gaze toward the skyline. "You're always watching," she observed. "Always thinking." Shawn nodded. "I am learning." "What are you learning up here?" He considered this, that there's a pattern to everything, to the way people move, the way money moves. If you can see the pattern, you can move with it. Or against it. Gloria smiled slightly. You sound like you're already somewhere else. I'm right here, Shawn said. For now. As they stood in comfortable silence, the city spread before them. Shawn turned the lessons of his first 15 years in his mind like a complex equation approaching solution. He was a product of Marcy Houses, of Gloria's unwavering expectations, of Eric's harsh tutelage, of absence and presence, of the crack era's brutal economics and hip-hop's verbal dexterity. He hadn't yet become Jay-Z. That transformation still lay ahead. But in the quiet, observant boy with the shoulder scar and the photographic memory, the foundation was already set. The architecture of his future self was taking shape, the loyalty code, the ownership mentality, the strategist's eye for pattern and opportunity. The wind picked up, carrying the sounds of the neighborhood, a car stereo playing Run DMC, children's voices from the playground, the distant wail of a siren. Shawn closed his eyes briefly, committing this moment to memory like everything else. Another piece in the mosaic he was constructing, thought by thought, experience by experience. Time to come inside, Gloria said finally. It's getting cold. Man. Shawn nodded and took one last look at the Manhattan skyline before following his mother back into the building, down the stairs and into apartment 6J, where his present circumstances waited, along with the mental blueprints of a future still unwritten but already taking form in the architectural precision of his mind. The midnight air was heavy with summer heat as Shawn Carter leaned against the building's weathered brick facade, counting folded bills under amber streetlight. In the distance, the muffled thump of an Eric B. and Rakim track escaped from someone's open window, providing rhythm to the nocturnal commerce of Marcy Houses. The year was 1986, and in Bedford-Stuyvesant, money moved in hushed transactions at corner spots like this one, where young men with watchful eyes conducted their business under the constant threat of police cruisers and rival dealers. $2.75, he muttered to himself, tucking the cash into his pocket. Not bad for a few hours' work. The mathematics of the street economy were simple but brutal: sell product, avoid arrest, stay alive, and repeat. At 19, Shawn had mastered this calculus of survival, developing a reputation for reliability that distinguished him in a marketplace where trust was the scarcest commodity. But as he walked back to his apartment, another set of numbers occupied his thoughts. $500, the purse from last week's rap battle at the community center. His opponent had been technically proficient, but Shawn had dismantled him with cool precision, crafting insults that left the crowd howling while maintaining the composed demeanor that was becoming his signature. The victory wasn't just financial, it had solidified something in his mind, a possibility that words might someday replace what he carried in his pockets. "You still thinking about that battle?" asked a familiar voice from the stoop. Jazzo sat there nursing a bottle of Old English, his silhouette outlined against the building's security light. A few years older than Shawn, Jazz had already established himself as a name in Brooklyn's underground rap scene, having secured a deal with EMI Records that seemed miraculous to those still battling in high school cafeterias and community centers. "Nah, just calculating," Shawn replied, settling beside his mentor. "Your problem is, you're always calculating," Jazz laughed. "Even when you're rhyming, I can see those numbers running behind your eyes." Shawn shrugged. It wasn't an accusation he could deny. That's because everything's an equation. Street or studio, it's all about margin. Jazz nodded, the streetlight catching the gold of his thick chain. "Speaking of studio, I got some time booked next week. Thinking you might want to come through, drop a verse." The casual offer carried weight that Shawn immediately recognized. Studio time wasn't just expensive. It represented legitimacy. The crossing of a threshold from amateur to professional that few made. "What's the track?" Shawn asked, maintaining his composure despite the acceleration of his pulse. "Something called Hawaiian Sophie label wants something with crossover potential." Jazz's tone suggested mixed feelings about the commercial direction. "They're pushing me toward a sound that'll play on radio. Figure having you on it might keep it grounded." The night air seemed to pause around them as Shawn considered the invitation. The studio represented a different world, one where talent might be converted into legitimate income, where the constant vigilance of street corners could be exchanged for a different kind of hustle. "What time?" was all he said. The recording studio on West 42nd Street was nothing like Shawn had imagined. Instead of the sleek, modern space he'd envisioned from music videos, it was a cramped room with foam-padded walls, smelling of cigarettes and day-old Chinese food. But the equipment, the mixing board with its hundreds of knobs and faders, the reel-to-reel tape machine, the isolation booth with its professional microphone. This was the machinery of legitimacy. "Don't touch anything," the engineer warned as Shawn examined the control room with undisguised curiosity. A heavy-set white man in his 40s, he treated the equipment with the protective instinct of a parent. "That board costs more than you'll make in 10 years. Jazz shot the engineer a look. "He's with me, Rick. He's good." Shawn said nothing, absorbing every detail. The way Jazz carried himself here was different. Confident but deferential to the technical expertise of the engineer, understanding the hierarchy of this new domain. This was knowledge worth more than any advice about dealing. This was the infrastructure of a world where creativity could be captured, packaged, and sold without the risk of prison. "We're rolling on Hawaiian Sophie," the engineer announced, his fingers adjusting levels on the console. Backing track first, then vocals. For the next hour, Shawn watched Jazz work, studying how he approached the microphone, how he listened to playback with critical attention, how he negotiated with the engineer about levels and effects. When Jazz finally nodded toward the booth, indicating it was Shawn's turn, he felt both prepared and completely unprepared. Inside the isolation booth, the headphones created an intimate universe of sound. The track's beat pulsed through his body as he adjusted to the sensation of hearing his own voice amplified and isolated. The first take was stiff, too deliberate. The second loosened, but lacked energy. "Relax," Jazz's voice came through the headphones. "Think of it like a battle, but the beat is your opponent. You're not trying to destroy it, you're trying to bend it to your will." On the third take, something clicked. Shawn found the pocket of the rhythm, riding it with the same instinctive timing he used when controlling conversations on the street. When he finished, he saw Jazz nodding through the glass, a smile spreading across his face. "That's it," Jazz said, "but let's try one more with some ad-libs. Just feel it out." When the beat dropped again, Shawn felt a surge of confidence. At the end of his verse, without planning it, he called out, "Young Hov." The nickname, shortened from Jehovah, a playful reference to his wisdom beyond years, had been circulating among friends, but this was the first time he'd claimed it on record. In the control room, playback revealed a transformation. The verse was tight, professional, indistinguishable in quality from what established artists were doing. As they listened, Jazz placed a hand on Shawn's shoulder, a gesture of approval that carried more weight than any verbal praise. "Man," the engineer admitted, "you got a voice for this." Natural tone. Later, as they walked through Times Square, Jazz explained the business beyond the booth. "So they'll send me the session fee next week, probably around $1,500. I'll break you off $500 for the feature." Shawn absorbed this information with the same analytical mind he applied to his other business. $500 for a few hours' work, with no risk beyond potential embarrassment. The economics were compelling. What about publishing? He asked, remembering conversations he'd overheard between Jazz and his manager. Jazz looked surprised by the question. "You been paying attention?" "Yeah, there's publishing, but on this track, it's complicated. I signed my rights to EMI's publishing division, standard for new artists." He frowned slightly. Lesson 1. Never give away your publishing if you can help it. That's where the long money lives. As they passed the electronic billboard displaying the Dow Jones numbers, reaching new highs under Reagan's economy, Shawn felt the disconnect between that America and his own. On Wall Street, 22-year-old Harvard graduates were making millions moving paper assets around. In Brooklyn, young men his age were lucky to survive to 25, much less build anything lasting. "You know what separates us from them?" Shawn asked, nodding toward the financial district's distant silhouette. "Besides everything, Jazz replied with a dry laugh. Infrastructure, Shawn said, the word feeling important in his mouth. They got systems built for them. We got to build our own. By early 1988, Shawn had established a delicate balance. Mornings and afternoons belonged to the street economy, managing his corner, maintaining relationships with suppliers, navigating the increasing police presence as the city's war on drugs intensified. Evenings and weekends increasingly belonged to music battles, occasional studio sessions with Jazz, and endless hours of writing, the words flowing more naturally with practice. The release of Hawaiian Sophie had created no seismic shift in his life, but it had planted a seed. There was his voice, preserved on vinyl, circulating in the world. The record hadn't charted, but it had received radio play, been stocked in record stores. When he'd first heard it on WBLS, the sensation was unlike anything he'd experienced, not just pride, but a vision of possibility. On a cold February night, he sat at the kitchen table of his small apartment, bills spread before him. The mathematics were shifting. A good week on the corner could still generate more immediate cash than music, but the risk-adjusted return was becoming questionable. Every month brought news of another acquaintance, arrested or shot. Meanwhile, his reputation in battle circles was growing, commanding higher stakes and drawing attention from people connected to the industry. A knock at the door interrupted his calculations. It was DeHaven, his longtime friend and business partner, his face tight with tension. 5-0 hit the spot on Myrtle, DeHaven said without preamble. Took everything. Marco's locked up. Shawn absorbed this information, mentally adjusting inventory and cash projections. Marco had been one of their reliable workers, careful and consistent. His absence would create a vulnerability in their operation. Bail? Shawn asked. 10,000, first offense, but they're trying to make an example. Reagan's new mandatory minimums. The conversation shifted to logistics. Which lawyer to call, how to restructure territory, whether Marco could be trusted not to inform. Throughout, Shawn felt a strange detachment, as if watching the discussion from a distance. The hustle that had once seemed like his only viable path now felt increasingly like an anchor, tying him to risks that no longer aligned with his evolving calculation of the future. Later that night, unable to sleep, he pulled out a notebook filled with rhymes. In the margin of one page, he began sketching numbers, not sales projections or supply costs, but a different kind of accounting. If he committed fully to music, what would it take to replace his street income? How many shows per month? What kind of recording deal? Was there a way to retain more control than what he'd seen Jazz navigate? His pen moved to a fresh page where he wrote, "I sold kilos of coke. I'm guessing I can sell CDs." The line captured something essential about his emerging philosophy, that the fundamental skills of business transcended the product. Understanding human psychology, creating demand, managing distribution networks, building brand loyalty, these were universal principles that operated whether the product was illegal or legitimate. The summer of 1989 found Shawn in a new role, observing from the control booth as Jazz recorded vocals for his album. EMI had increased the budget, allowing for a better studio and a recognized producer. For Shawn, these sessions were an education more valuable than any he could have accessed formally. He watched how contracts were negotiated, how studio time was allocated, how creative differences were resolved between artist, producer, and label. "You see what I'm dealing with?" Jazz complained during a break, gesturing toward the departed A&R representative who had been pushing for more commercial-sounding tracks. "Man wants me to water everything down, make it palatable for suburban radio." Shawn nodded, but his mind was already analyzing the dynamic from multiple angles. The label had invested money, had expected return. Jazz wanted artistic integrity, but needed the label's distribution network. Both had leverage, both had vulnerabilities. "Maybe there's a middle path," Shawn suggested. "Give them one or two tracks that can cross over, but keep the core of the album true to what you want to say." Jazz looked at him with newfound respect. "When did you become the diplomat?" I remember when your solution to everything was to stare a man down until he backed up. Shawn smiled slightly. Different problems, different tactics. Street taught me when to press and when to negotiate. This is a negotiation situation. As the session resumed, the producer, a veteran who had worked with Big Daddy Kane and Biz Markie, beckoned Shawn over to the mixing board. "You got a good ear," he said quietly. "I've been watching you during playback. You catch things that offbeat hi-hat, the vocal flub in the second verse." Shawn nodded, accepting the compliment without false modesty. "You producing yet?" the producer asked. "Learning," Shawn replied. "No equipment of my own yet." The producer nodded toward the SP-1200 drum machine in the corner. "That right there, that's your investment if you're serious. Learn that machine inside out, and you can build foundations." The conversation stuck with Shawn as he rode the subway back to Brooklyn that night. The SP-1200 cost nearly $2,000, a significant investment, but not impossible. What it represented was more significant, a move from performer to creator, from talent to architect. As the train rumbled beneath the city, Shawn gazed at his reflection in the window, superimposed over the darkness of the tunnel. At 22, he stood at a crossroads that felt increasingly defined. The street economy had served its purpose, providing capital and business education when no other doors were open. But its ceilings low, its risks escalating, and its endgame non-existent. Music offered something different, not just potential income, but the creation of value that could outlast any individual transaction. A record, once made, continued to generate revenue. A reputation, once established, could be leveraged across platforms. And unlike cocaine, which was consumed and forgotten, music became part of people's lives, embedded in their memories and identities. The train emerged from the tunnel, the Manhattan skyline glittering across the East River. Shawn's reflection now shared the window with those distant towers of wealth and power. He wasn't naive enough to believe that music alone would grant him entry to those heights, but he recognized that it offered something the street never could, a legitimate infrastructure upon which to build. As Bedford-Stuyvesant came into view, its familiar landscape of project buildings and corner stores, Shawn made a decision. He would begin the transition, gradually, carefully, maintaining his street income while building his music presence until the latter could fully replace the former. It wasn't just about avoiding prison or death, it was about recognizing where the greater potential lay. The luxury hustler archetype that had been forming in his mind, the figure who applied street knowledge to legitimate business, who understood both worlds but was trapped by neither. This was the path forward, not just surviving, but building something that could grow beyond the limitations of any corner. The train slowed as it approached his stop. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, product to move, money to collect, problems to solve. But now these tasks felt temporary, transitional means rather than ends. The real work, the work that mattered, was in the studio, on the page, in the gradual construction of an identity that could transform words into wealth. As he stepped onto the platform, Shawn Carter carried with him the certainty that he was not just switching hustles, but elevating them from selling what destroyed to creating what endured. The young man who would become Jay-Z was beginning to see not just the game, but how to change it entirely. The rain sliced across Manhattan's skyline, droplets glinting in the light of an autumn dusk. Shawn Carter watched from the window of a cramped office space in Tribeca, his reflection ghosting against the backdrop of a city that had repeatedly told him no. The room behind him buzzed with tension. Dame Dash pacing like a caged panther, Kareem Biggs Burke sitting quietly, calculator in hand, reviewing figures for the 5th time that afternoon. "They want my voice, but not me," Jay said quietly, turning from the window. At 25, he was already considered too old by industry standards, an elder statesman in a game that worshipped youth and novelty. The rejection from Payday Records still stung. They'd been so close. Contract discussions, handshakes, talk of advance money. Then silence, phone calls unreturned. The disappointment had calcified into something harder, more useful. This priority distribution deal, Damon said, tapping a manila folder on the desk. It's not ideal, but it's what we've got. EMI handles the trucks, the stores, the physical movement. We handle everything else. Everything else means everything, Jay replied, his voice measured, deliberate. Production, marketing, radio, publicity. Biggs looked up from his calculations. 35,000. That's what we have between us. That's the stake. That's the stake. The number hung in the air. $35,000. Not nothing, but a pittance in an industry where 6 figures was the entry point for serious consideration. Most of it was Jay's, money from years moving weight through the Northeast Corridor, Virginia to New York. The street education had been expensive, dangerous. Now it was capital. The Roc-A-Fella Records idea had begun as bravado, a response to rejection. It was becoming something else, a necessity born of exclusion, transformed through vision into opportunity. Russell said the same thing, Jay remarked, remembering his conversations with Def Jam's founder. Too street, too old. Told me to try something commercial. Fuck commercial, Damon spat. He was the firebrand, the unfiltered voice in their trinity. They want watered-down shit they can market to suburbs. It's not personal, Biggs said, ever the pragmatist. It's structural. The machine isn't built for what we're doing. Jay nodded. He understood systems, supply chains, distribution networks, territory management. The crack game had been brutal business education. The music industry operated on similar principles: control the supply, manage the territory, eliminate competition. The difference was legality, not logic. So we build our own machine, Jay said simply. Delaware, 2 weeks later. A nondescript government building, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The LLC paperwork cost $200 to file. Roc-A-Fella Records, officially a legal entity. The name itself was aspiration, a nod to Standard Oil's founder, America's first billionaire. It was hubris, perhaps, but necessary hubris. In the car heading back to New York, Jay studied the paperwork. Now we're official, he said. Priority takes their cut, but the masters stay with us. The masters are everything, Biggs noted. He understood publishing, royalties, the long game. 20 years from now, owning your work is the difference between wealth and memory. The highway stretched between Delaware and New York like arteries, carrying them back to a city that had changed dramatically since their childhoods. Mayor Giuliani's broken windows. Policing was reshaping the streets. Compstat was transforming enforcement. The crack epidemic that had ravaged neighborhoods was plateauing, but the damage was generational. Whole blocks decimated, families shattered. You hear about the crime bill? Damon asked, navigating through light traffic. 3 strikes, Jay nodded. Biden and Clinton. 100,000 new cops. More brothers going away, Biggs said quietly. The political reality shaped their urgency. There was no safety net, no fallback position. The $35,000 investment wasn't just business capital. It was a life raft. The Priority Records offices in Los Angeles were sleek compared to their makeshift operation in New York. The distribution deal wasn't ideal. They'd take significantly less money per unit, but retain control of their masters. Ownership over access. The equation was simple when viewed through the lens of the long game. We don't need A&R, Jay explained to the distribution executives. We know what works in our market. We need trucks, store relationships, physical placement. The executives exchanged glances. They weren't used to artists who understood the mechanics of the business, who spoke the language of units and percentages rather than dreams and exposure. Breakage fees are standard, one executive said. Returns will eat into margins. You understand that? We understand margin erosion, Jay replied evenly. We also understand leverage. Outside, palm trees swayed in a breeze that felt nothing like the cutting wind of New York autumn. California represented a different America, one where the Cold War's end had ushered in economic optimism rather than continued struggle. Back in New York, reality set in. Their office was a small space with second-hand furniture. Their promotional budget was whatever they could scrape together. While major labels deployed armies of promoters and publicists, they had themselves and a handful of loyal friends. Hand delivery, Jay instructed, sorting through boxes of promotional singles. DJs, mixtape makers, club promoters. Person to person. The street team nodded. This was guerrilla marketing before the term had entered the business lexicon. Direct distribution, targeted placement, relationship leverage. Hot 97 is the target, Damon added. The radio station had launched in 1992 and become the tastemaker for hip-hop in New York. Funk Flex, Angie Martinez. We need rotations. Jay understood the ecosystem. While Bad Boy and Def Jam had infrastructure, they had hustle and hunger. The playing field wasn't level, but there were advantages to being underestimated. That night, in a small studio in Manhattan, Jay listened to beats. The clock read 2:17 a.m. He'd been writing for hours, refining verses, building what would become Reasonable Doubt, though the album's title hadn't yet crystallized. The material was autobiographical, analytical, a memoir in 16 bars. Not the party anthems dominating radio, but something more enduring. This ain't radio, the engineer remarked, adjusting levels. This is something else. Jay nodded. He wasn't chasing what worked last summer. He was building something that might last decades. The gamble was that authenticity could find market fit, that grown man rap could find an audience tired of adolescent fantasies. Winter 1995. Snow-blanketed New York, transforming grime into temporary beauty. In a small restaurant in Harlem, the three partners celebrated their first small victory, a single that had gained traction on mixtapes, generating buzz in Brooklyn and the Bronx. To ownership, Big said, raising a glass. To necessity, Jay corrected with a slight smile. Let's be honest, this wasn't first choice. This was last resort. The best choices often are, Damon replied. Nobody chooses the hard path first. Around them, the restaurant hummed with energy. The fashion was changing. Tommy Hilfiger was ascendant, Versace becoming the language of aspiration. The economy was slowly improving, though the benefits hadn't reached many of the neighborhoods they came from. You know what's crazy? Jay said, leaning back. When I was hustling, I was risking my freedom every day for less than we're betting on this. But the payoff's different, Biggs noted. This builds, compounds. The other way is just survival. Jay nodded. He'd started seeing music as intellectual property rather than performance, assets that generated returns over time rather than one-time paydays. Publishing, royalties, master ownership, the frameworks that separated artists who made money from those who built wealth. We took a lesser deal, he said, but we own our work. It would become a mantra, a philosophy, repeated in interviews and backstage conversations for years to come. The principle wasn't complicated, but executing it in an industry designed to extract ownership was revolutionary. The small studio had become a second home. Jay's process was methodical. No written lyrics, everything composed and memorized mentally before recording. It preserved a freshness that pen to paper sometimes lost. That's it, he said, stepping back from the microphone after laying down another verse. That's the take. That's the take. The engineer nodded appreciatively. What sounded effortless was the product of obsessive craft, internal rhyme schemes, extended metaphors, narrative cohesion. Jay's time with Jazz-O years earlier had taught him technical precision. Life had provided the content. Outside, New York continued its transformation. Times Square was being sanitized, its peep shows and grime replaced with corporate theaters and chain restaurants. The internet existed but remained a niche tool, used primarily by academics and military personnel. Cell phones were bulky status symbols for Wall Street types. Information still moved mouth to ear, physically rather than digitally. In this analog world, independence meant something different. It meant physical distribution, hand-to-hand marketing, paper contracts, and face-to-face relationships. It was harder, more labor-intensive, but the rewards of ownership were worth the additional effort. "We're building something," Jay told a small gathering of supporters at a listening session. "Not just music. Infrastructure." The word seemed pretentious to some, but Jay understood that lasting power required systems, not just songs. Roc-A-Fella wasn't just a label, it was becoming a blueprint for independence and an industry designed for dependency. December 1995. Christmas lights twinkled across Manhattan, transforming the city's harshness into temporary magic. In a small office, the three partners reviewed their progress. "We're in the game," Biggs said, reviewing financial statements. "Not winning yet, but in the game." Damon, ever restless, was already thinking about expansion. "Clothing next," he said. "Merchandising. Lifestyle." Jay studied a contract before him, a potential deal with a smaller radio promoter. His ability to read agreements, to understand terms and implications, had become invaluable. He'd developed an instinct for where the traps were hidden, where seemingly standard language concealed long-term costs. "The infrastructure is coming together," he said. "Distribution, production, promotion, building block by building block." Outside, snow began to fall again, fat flakes illuminated by streetlights. New York in winter, beautiful, harsh, unforgiving. Like the industry they were trying to conquer, it rewarded preparation and punished hesitation. "To 1996, Damon said, not waiting for midnight. "The year everything changes." Jay nodded, allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. The rejection tour of 1995 had been painful but clarifying. Every closed door had pushed them toward ownership, toward building rather than asking. The $35,000 stake, a fortune in their world, was just the beginning. As the snow accumulated outside, transforming concrete into canvas, Jay thought about transformation, about alchemy, about turning rejection into foundation, exclusion into empire. The path wasn't clear yet, but the direction was. Own, don't rent. Build, don't borrow. In the quiet of that December night, with winter settling across the city, something was ending and beginning simultaneously. The hustle to microphone journey was completing its first cycle. The DIY or die decision had been made, not as choice, but as necessity. And necessity, as they would learn in the years ahead, was the most honest teacher of all. The grey winter light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the studio control room. Outside, Manhattan was entering its evening transformation. Headlights cutting through early darkness, steam rising from subway grates, the city's pulse quickening as day workers retreated and night dwellers emerged. Shawn Carter, known professionally as Jay, Z leaned back in the leather studio chair, letting his eyes close momentarily as he absorbed the playback of Devils. The bass line rumbled through the monitors, vibrating the console. His producer, DJ Premier, sat motionless beside him, head nodding almost imperceptibly, a silent metronome acknowledging the rhythm's precision. "Run it back," Jay said quietly, opening his eyes. "Let me hear that bridge again." It was January 1996, and what would become Reasonable Doubt was nearing completion, 12 tracks distilled from years of observation, participation, and calculation. Not his first recording, but his first statement of purpose. The stakes felt different now. Premier rewound the tape, the mechanical whir of expensive recording equipment filling the silence. Beyond the glass partition, Kareem Biggs Burke stood with arms crossed, listening. Jay caught his eye and received a slight nod, the signature Biggs gesture that contained multitudes of approval. "People been sleeping on this," Biggs said later as they walked through the Tribeca night, breath clouding in the cold air. "But they're gonna wake up real soon." Jay pulled his collar tighter against the wind. "They better. We put everything into this." Everything was more than metaphorical. Roc-A-Fella Records, the independent label Jay had formed with Biggs and Dame Dash the previous year, represented their collective resources, connections, and ambitions compressed into corporate form. The initial $35,000 investment seemed simultaneously massive and insufficient for what they needed to accomplish. When Reasonable Doubt dropped in June 1996, the summer heat had transformed New York into a pressure cooker. The first week's numbers came in, 43,000 units. Not a blockbuster by industry standards, but respectable for an independent release with limited marketing muscle behind it. Dame paced the small Roc-A-Fella office, phone cradled between shoulder and ear, negotiating with distributors while gesturing emphatically. 43K is just the beginning, he insisted, voice carrying through the thin walls. We need another shipment to Philly yesterday. Baltimore too. The demand is there. Jay sat at a folding table, calculator in hand, breaking down the economics, manufacturing costs, distribution percentages, retail markup. The math was unforgiving but essential. At roughly $2 to $4 profits per unit after all the cuts were taken, every 1,000 records mattered. We keep this momentum, he said quietly as Dame hung up. We can hit 100,000 by September. 500,000 by next summer. Dame's energy filled the room as he dropped into the chair across from Jay. You see what Biggie did? What Pac is doing? That's our lane right there. But we got a tour. Albums sell albums. Jay nodded, already thinking through the logistics. Touring meant $5,000 to $15,000 per night depending on the venue. Decent money, but with travel costs, paying the DJ, security, and other expenses. The margins thinned quickly. Still, each show meant new converts, new markets, album sales at the merchandise table. The economics of attention. Set it up, Jay said. Start with the Northeast corridor, then push south. I won 50 dates minimum by December. The wetlands in Tribeca was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Backstage, Jay stood alone, eyes closed, running through the set list in his head. Unlike most rappers, he never wrote down his lyrics. They existed in his mind, retrievable at will, modifiable on the fly. This mental discipline was both artistic choice and practical defense. Growing up in Marcy Houses had instilled a certain wariness about leaving evidence. Words on paper could be discovered, misinterpreted, used against you. Words in your head belonged only to you. The DJ's voice boomed through the speakers. Y'all ready for the real? Make some noise for Jay-Z. He stepped onto the stage into a wall of sound. Not the massive roar of arena shows he would later command, but the concentrated energy of a room where proximity amplified enthusiasm. Every face visible, every reaction readable. These intimate venues were crucibles, where reputation was forged or forgotten. 90 minutes later, drenched in sweat, Jay counted out cash with the venue manager in a cramped back office. $7,000 for the night. After expenses, maybe $4,000 clear. Not life-changing money, but another brick in the foundation. Outside, fans lingered by the tour van, hoping for autographs or conversation. He obliged a few, keeping his interactions brief but genuine. A young man in a Yankees cap held out a CD. This changed everything for me, man, he said, voice slightly trembling. The way you talk about making it out, it's like you're speaking directly to me. Jay studied him for a moment. That's exactly what I'm doing. He signed the CD and moved on, but the exchange lingered in his mind. The fall of 1996 passed in a blur of performances, radio appearances, and overnight drives between cities. The album was gaining traction, 86,000 units by October, with momentum building. Music publications were taking notice, many critics catching up to what early listeners had recognized. This wasn't merely street reportage, but something more literary and complex. December found Jay in a hotel room in Cleveland, watching snow accumulate on the windowsill. The radiator clanked and hissed, struggling against the Midwestern chill. Dame was on the phone in the adjoining room, voice rising and falling as he negotiated with a promoter in Detroit. Jay's own phone rang. Ty, one of his oldest friends. How's the road treating you? Ty asked. Cold as hell out here, Jay replied, but the shows are good. Selling out most nights now. Word around the way is the album's about to go gold. Jay had done the math repeatedly. Not yet. But we're getting there. Maybe by spring. You coming home for Christmas? The question carried weight beyond its simplicity. Home was complicated. memories of absence overlaid with presence. His father, Adnis, had left when Jay was 11. That wound still informed his approach to loyalty, to business, to trust. Who stays when it gets difficult? Who leaves? These questions shaped his decisions, his partnerships, even his creative process. "Yeah," Jay said finally. "I'll be there." January 1997 brought both validation and new challenges. Reasonable Doubt had sold 112,000 copies, a respectable showing for a debut on an independent label. The tour had added another layer of revenue, with Jay's take approaching $100,000 when all the dates were tallied. But internal tensions at Roc-A-Fella were becoming apparent. Dame's confrontational business style created both opportunities and problems. Biggs remained the silent stabilizer. Jay increasingly found himself mediating between partners while simultaneously crafting his next artistic statement. The solution, they collectively decided, was restructuring. Jay would assume the presidency of Roc-A-Fella Records, formalizing the leadership role he had already been playing. Dame would focus on business development and marketing, Biggs on operations and talent scouting. They sealed the arrangement over dinner at Justin's restaurant in Manhattan, where industry power brokers mingled with artists and the newly affluent. The conversation turned to their next strategic moves. "We need to start developing other artists," Jay said, sipping Crystal, an emerging signature that bridged his lyrics and lifestyle. "Build a roster. Create a sound." Dane nodded enthusiastically. "Memphis Bleak is ready. We put him out next, then leverage that to bring in more talent." "It's about building infrastructure," Jay continued. A&R, marketing, production relationships. We're not just making albums anymore. We're building something larger. The waiter delivered another bottle, uncorking it with practiced efficiency. Jay watched the bubbles rise in his glass, thinking about momentum, how it builds slowly, then suddenly accelerates beyond expectation. He had seen it in business, both legitimate and otherwise. The principle remained consistent across contexts. Early patience yields later advantage. The spring of 1997 brought Reasonable Doubt closer to the 500,000 mark gold certification within reach. More significantly, Jay had begun work on his sophomore album, In My Lifetime, Volume 1, with a new level of industry support behind him. The studio sessions took place primarily at Baseline Studios in Manhattan, where Jay's unconventional recording process fascinated engineers and collaborators alike. He would listen to a beat repeatedly, sometimes for hours, never writing a word. Then he would step to the microphone and deliver complete verses as if reading from an invisible text, a feat of memory and composition that few could comprehend, let alone replicate. One evening, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Jay finished recording Streets is Watching. The track captured the paranoia and vigilance required to navigate both his former life and his current ascent. As the playback ended, the control room fell silent. "That's the one," said the engineer, breaking the silence. "That's the single." Jay nodded slightly. The track embodied his current position, one foot in his past, one in his future, eyes constantly scanning for threats and opportunities. Success was bringing new forms of scrutiny. The authenticity that gave his music power also invited questions about his history, his choices, his transformations. Later that night, in his apartment overlooking the city, Jay stood at the window watching lightning illuminate the skyline in staccato flashes. His phone rang, his mother, Gloria. "I heard your song on the radio today," she said, pride evident in her voice. "At the office. My co-workers couldn't believe it was my son." Jay smiled. "Which track?" "The one about the hard knock life." "That's not out yet, Ma." "Must have been something else." "Well, whatever it was good." She paused. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "Eating right?" The question contained layers of concern, of history. Gloria had held the family together after Adnis left, working at an investment firm, showing Jay glimpses of a world beyond Marcy. Those glimpses had seeded ambitions that extended beyond music. "I'm good, Ma. Building something that's going to last." After they hung up, Jay returned to the window. Below, the city continued its nocturnal rhythm taxis, ferrying late-night revelers, service workers beginning early morning shifts, the perpetual motion of ambition and necessity. He was approaching 30 in age when many artists had already peaked, when many from his neighborhood had met grimmer fates. Yet he felt as if he was just beginning to understand the game's true dimensions. Music was the platform, but ownership was the goal. Publishing rights, master recordings, brand equity. These were the instruments of genuine leverage. The first $100,000 had been the hardest proof that the model worked, that his voice had commercial value beyond artistic merit. The next million would require more than rhymes. It would demand strategic vision, calculated risk, and the ability to convert cultural currency into financial capital. Jay turned from the window and picked up a notebook, not for lyrics, but for numbers. In neat columns, he tracked revenue streams, projected growth, potential partnerships. The mathematics of independence, the architecture of empire. Outside, the storm began to subside, leaving behind the muted symphony of a city between midnight and dawn. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new verses forming in the quiet laboratory of his mind. But for now, in this moment of temporary stillness, Shawn Carter allowed himself a rare luxury, satisfaction with the distance already traveled, combined with absolute certainty about the journey ahead. The midnight blue Lincoln Navigator glided through Manhattan, its tinted windows reflecting the neon glow of a city that never truly slept. Inside, Shawn Carter, Jay-Z to the world, sat in contemplative silence, watching the skyline scroll past. The year was 1998, and something seismic had just occurred, though the full magnitude had yet to register. 500,000 in the first week, Dame Dash said, breaking the silence as he examined the preliminary sales figures on a sheet of paper. Volume 2 is different, Jay. This isn't just street heat. This is crossing over. Jay nodded, his expression measured despite the internal celebration. The album, Volume 2, Hard Knock Life, had indeed landed differently. The Annie sample that anchored the title track had been a calculated risk, a bridge between worlds that many in his circle had questioned. Now that bridge was groaning under the weight of unprecedented foot traffic. Suburbs buying it, Biggs added from the other side of the Navigator's spacious interior. White kids in Minnesota know the words. That's different. That's different. Different indeed. Jay's thoughts drifted to the long conversations with producers, the debates over the Annie sample clearance costs, an expensive gamble that was now paying off at a scale none of them had fully anticipated. We should be thinking about the tour differently now, Jay finally said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his signature. Not just clubs. We need arenas. By early 1999, different had transformed into undeniable. The Hard Knock Life Tour rolled through 54 cities, a hip-hop juggernaut featuring DMX, Method Man, and Redman alongside Jay-Z. The venues weren't just filled, they were sold out, a sea of jersey-clad fans waving their arms to anthems that had once been confined to Brooklyn street corners. Jay stood backstage at Madison Square Garden, watching the monitors as DMX stalked the stage like a caged predator. The crowd's energy was electric, a physical force that hummed through the concrete walls. 18 million, his financial advisor had told him earlier that day. That's the gross tour revenue projection. Your cut will be north of $2 million when it's done. $2 million. From performances alone. Add to that the album royalties that continued to pour in as Volume 2 pushed past 5 million units sold, and the reality was stark. Shawn Carter had become a millionaire. Not just on paper, not just in lyrical boasts, but in actual liquid assets. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find Dame holding the bottle of crystal and 2 glasses. We need to talk about Roc-A-Fella, Dame said, pouring the champagne. The samples are ready. Manufacturing costs are locked. We launched this year. Jay nodded, taking the glass. Roc-A-Fella had been gestating for months. their answer to Puff's Shawn John, Russell's Fat Farm. But where others saw fashion lines, Jay saw architecture, a foundation upon which empires could be built. "Get the lawyers to structure it right," Jay replied. "This isn't just merch. This is the beginning of something bigger." The Roc-A-Fella launch in 1999 exceeded even their bullish projections. What began as graphic tees and denim evolved rapidly into a comprehensive urban lifestyle brand. By mid-2000, the line was projecting $50 million in revenue, a number that seemed fantastical until the purchase orders from Macy's and other major retailers began stacking up. "We're not just selling clothes," Jay explained to a group of potential investors in a sleek midtown conference room. "We're selling aspiration. The same aspiration that sells the records." A symphony of nodding heads. These men, mostly older, mostly white, might not understand the cultural nuances of his lyrics, but they understood the language of profit margins and brand equity. In their eyes, he was no longer just a rapper, but an entrepreneur with a proprietary distribution channel to an untapped demographic. After the meeting, Jay sat alone in his office at Roc-A-Fella's headquarters, reviewing the preliminary profit-sharing statements for Roc-A-Fella. The brand was on track to net him between $3 and $5 million annually by 2001, a revenue stream entirely separate from his music. The intercom buzzed. "There's a producer here to see you. Says his name is Kanye West." Jay sighed. Another eager beatmaker with a CD full of dreams. But something about the name triggered recognition. This was the kid hip-hop had mentioned, the one with the soul samples. "Send him in." The young man who entered carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Under his arm was a folder of beats, and in his eyes was a hunger Jay recognized immediately. It was the same hunger he'd carried through Brooklyn a lifetime ago. "I've got something different," Kanye said without preamble. "Soul samples, chipmunk style, but elevated." Jay gestured to the sound system. "Let me hear it." The 1999 nightclub incident at Club New York cast a long shadow over Jay's expanding empire. The stabbing of Lance Rivera allegedly over bootlegged music threatened to drag him back into a world he was financially outgrowing but culturally still tethered to. In his penthouse apartment, with its panoramic views of a city he was increasingly conquering, Jay sat with his legal team. The room was somber, the stakes clear. "The DA wants to make an example," his lead attorney explained, sliding a document across the polished table. "But we have room to negotiate. A misdemeanor plea could be on the table." Jay studied the paper, weighing consequences that extended far beyond potential jail time. Roc-A-Fella was expanding. The next album was taking shape. Corporate partnerships, unthinkable just years earlier, were now being discussed. A conviction could unravel it all. "What's the timeline?" Jay asked. "We can probably stretch this into 2001, but eventually a decision has to be made." Jay nodded, understanding the subtext. This was about more than legal maneuvering. It was about brand preservation. The old world and new were colliding, and he would need to navigate the impact with precision. The MTV Unplugged session in 2001 represented yet another evolution. Backed by the roots, Jay delivered his street narratives through a lens of undeniable musicianship. The format historically reserved for rock acts embraced him as an artist transcending genre. In the green room after the performance, Questlove approached with evident respect. "That was something special," the drummer said. "You just changed the conversation about what hip-hop can be in a live setting." Jay smiled, understanding the significance. Each of these moments, the Annie sample, the arena tour, the unplugged session, was a deliberate repositioning, not just of himself, but of hip-hop's place in the cultural hierarchy. Later that night, in a private meeting at Def Jam's offices, Jay sat across from label executives who were suddenly seeing him with new eyes. "We want to renegotiate your contract," they said, sliding over paperwork that outlined an advance exceeding $20 million and significantly improved royalty rates. Jay didn't react immediately, his poker face perfected through years of negotiations far more consequential. Inside, though, he recognized the moment for what it was, leverage transmuting into legitimate power. The creation of The Blueprint in 2001 marked a sonic shift that would influence hip-hop for the next decade. In a Manhattan studio bathed in soft light, Jay listened as Kanye and Just Blaze presented soul-sampling productions that felt simultaneously nostalgic and revolutionary. "This is the future," Jay said quietly, nodding along to what would become You Don't Know. The recording sessions acquired an almost mystical quality, late nights blending into early mornings, the studio becoming a laboratory where past and future collided. Jay's verses were sharper, more introspective, the hungry hustler now evolving into a strategic thinker mapping moves beyond music. Then came September 11, 2001. The unthinkable tragedy that redefined American life also happened to coincide with the Blueprint's release date. In a city suddenly transformed by grief and smoke, the album arrived as an unintended time capsule, the last cultural artifact of a pre-9/11 New York. Jay watched the towers fall from his apartment window, the surreal horror momentarily overshadowing any thought of album sales or business ventures. For days, like most New Yorkers, he moved through a haze of disbelief and solidarity. When he finally checked in with his team the following week, he learned that despite the national trauma, or perhaps because people needed the escape, The Blueprint had debuted at number 1. In December 2001, as the year drew to a close, Jay gathered his inner circle for dinner at a private room in Tribeca's most exclusive restaurant. Dame, Biggs, his attorneys, financial advisors. The brain trust that had helped transform Shawn Carter from Brooklyn hustler to multi-millionaire businessman. "I want to go through the numbers," Jay said as the meal concluded. All of it. All of it. Where we stand today versus 3 years ago." His CFO opened a leather portfolio. "Conservatively, your net worth is approaching 10 million, he began. "The music. 5 albums in heavy rotation, publishing, touring, that's your foundation. Approximately 6 million there." He turned a page. "Roc-A-Fella is generating between 3 and 5 million annually for you now. The Def Jam renegotiation adds another layer of security, and we haven't even factored in potential value from the Roc-A-Fella roster you're building." Jay nodded, absorbing the information not with celebration but with analytical detachment. $10 million. A fortune by most standards, but in his mind merely the first milestone on a much longer journey. "And the nightclub case?" he asked. "Resolved," his attorney confirmed. "The plea deal is done. 3 years probation, no jail time. The brand damage is minimal, possibly even a net positive in terms of authenticity balance." As the meeting concluded and his team filtered out, Jay remained at the table alone, swirling cognac in a crystal snifter. Through the window he could see Manhattan glittering in the winter night, the same city that had once seemed as remote and unattainable as the moon. The journey from 1998 to this moment had been dizzying in its velocity. The Hard Knock Life album and tour, Roc-A-Fella's launch and growth, the MTV Unplugged session, The Blueprint. Each step a deliberate evolution from artist to entrepreneur, from street credibility to corporate boardrooms. $10 million was not the destination. It was merely confirmation that the blueprint, his personal blueprint, was sound. The architecture was in place for something far more ambitious than wealth alone. As he signed the check and rose to leave, Jay-Z contemplated the next phase with the strategic patience that had become his hallmark. The first 10 million had required him to master multiple games simultaneously. The next 100 million would require him to rewrite the rules entirely. Manhattan, December 2002. Snow fell in lazy spirals outside the studio windows, dusting Fifth Avenue in a fleeting pristine white that would soon be churned to slush by morning traffic. Shawn Carter watched the flakes drift and dance, momentarily mesmerized by their silent descent. The control room of Baseline Studios hummed with the familiar electrical ambience of creativity. Analog equipment warming the air, the soft whir of hard drives capturing history. "Play it back one more time," he said, his voice low and measured, betraying none of the excitement he felt about this particular track. The engineer nodded, adjusting levels before the opening notes of "03 Bonnie and Clyde" filled the room. Beyonce's voice, sultry, powerful, yet somehow vulnerable, intertwined with his own in a musical conversation that felt like destiny. Their collaboration had begun as strictly professional, two artists at the top of their respective games, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. But something else was happening between them, something organic and unplanned. When the playback ended, silence filled the room for several contemplative seconds. "That's the one," Jay said finally, nodding slowly. "That's the single." Later that evening, as his driver navigated the glistening Manhattan streets, Jay found himself unusually contemplative. At 33, he'd achieved what most would consider the pinnacle of success in the music industry. Yet lately, he'd been questioning what true success actually meant. The single with Beyonce wasn't just another track. It represented something different, a partnership that transcended business, though he was still cautious about defining exactly what that meant. His phone buzzed with a message from Dame Dash about Roc-A-Fella's latest numbers. The clothing line was performing well, another extension of the empire they'd built from nothing. But even as the business expanded, tensions had begun forming at the foundation. Success had a way of revealing cracks in even the strongest alliances. Spring 2003, Central Park bloomed with renewal as Jay walked alongside Beyonce, both of them wearing inconspicuous attire, baseball caps pulled low, sunglasses shielding their eyes from both the sun and recognition. Their relationship had deepened over the months, private moments carefully guarded from the insatiable appetite of the public eye. "I've been thinking about something," Jay said, hands in his pockets as they followed the winding path. "Starting a foundation." Beyonce glanced at him, curious. "What kind?" "Scholarships. For kids who wouldn't otherwise get a shot at college. Kids from Marcy, places like that." He spoke matter-of-factly, but the idea had been keeping him awake at night. "The Shawn Carter Foundation," she said, testing the name. "I like it." "Education was always the way out that I didn't take," he said. "Music became my scholarship, but not everyone gets that break." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before he continued. "It's not just about giving back. It's about building something that stands separate from the music, from Roc-A-Fella, from all of it." Beyonce nodded, understanding the architecture of what he was constructing, not just businesses, but a legacy that would speak when the music eventually stopped. The Def Jam offices, October 2004. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan, the visual embodiment of what the position represented. Jay sat across from L.A. Reid, listening as the industry veteran outlined the offer to become president of Def Jam Recordings. The proposal represented a seismic shift, from artist to executive, from creating content to controlling it. "You've got the ear, the instinct," Reid said, leaning forward in his chair, his perfectly tailored suit a silent statement of corporate success. "Artists respect you. You can spot talent before anyone else even hears the whisper." Jay nodded, his expression neutral despite the significance of the moment. "It's not just about finding talent. It's about building systems around them, giving them what I never had coming up." "Exactly why you're the right person for this," Reid replied, though Jay detected a subtle tension beneath the encouragement. Reid was chairman, but power in corporate structures was rarely as clean as organizational charts suggested. Later that evening, in the quiet of his penthouse apartment, Jay poured a glass of scotch and called the one person whose counsel he truly valued. "They offered me the presidency," he said when Beyonce answered. "And?" Her voice was clear despite the distance between them. She was in Los Angeles filming. "I'm thinking about taking it." "What does your gut tell you?" Jay walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "That it's a test. Can I build something inside someone else's house? Can I run a system I didn't create? And if the answer is yes, then I'll know I can do more than I've done. If it's no," he paused, "then I'll know I need to own whatever I build next." Def Jam offices, December 2004. Jay's first weeks as president had been a flurry of meetings, contract reviews, and talent scouting. He'd made the corner office his own, though minimally. Awards and platinum plaques remained boxed up. This wasn't about displaying past achievements. It was about creating future ones. Ty Smith sat across from him, reviewing a stack of demo submissions. Their friendship stretched back to Marcy, long before recording contracts and corporate titles. Now, Ty was ascending the executive ranks alongside him, loyalty rewarded with opportunity. "This one," Ty said, sliding a CD across the desk. "Girl from Barbados, 16 years old. Voice like nothing I've heard." Jay examined the photo on the CD sleeve. "Rihanna," he read aloud. "Bring her in next week." The door opened, and an assistant entered with coffee. "Mr. Reed is asking for the quarterly projections for the urban division." Jay nodded, feeling the weight of the corporate apparatus around him. This was different from running Roc-A-Fella. There, decisions flowed directly from vision to execution. Here, each move required navigation through layers of corporate oversight, budget approvals, and strategic alignment with Universal Music Group's broader objectives. After the assistant left, Jay leaned back in his chair. "This is educational," he said, a hint of irony in his voice. Ty raised an eyebrow. "Having second thoughts already?" "Not second thoughts. Clearer thoughts." Jay stood and walked to the window. "I'm learning exactly what I need to know, which is the difference between having power and having ownership." He turned back to face his friend. "I can sign artists here. I can approve budgets up to a point. I can influence the direction of this label. But at the end of the day, I'm running someone else's business. Better to own one brick than rent the whole building." Jay smiled slightly. "Something like that. But while I'm here, we're going to make moves they'll study in business schools someday." A private dining room at Nobu, February 2004. Jay sat with Russell Simmons, both men enjoying the rare quiet of a restaurant, usually buzzing with celebrity sightings and power lunches. Their relationship had evolved over the years from distant respect to something closer to mentorship, though Jay was careful never to position himself as anyone's protege. "The Def Jam presidency is a good move," Russell said, using chopsticks with practiced ease. "But it's just one piece of what you're building." Jay nodded. "I'm studying your playbook. Music to fashion to film." He paused. "But I'm thinking about what comes after that." "After?" Russell smiled. "Brother, most people never even get to the fashion part." "I'm not most people," Jay replied, not as boast but as simple fact. "The foundation is up and running now. Scholarships going out to kids who remind me of myself, minus the bad decisions. Philanthropy is good for the soul and the tax return," Russell said with a knowing smile. "It's more than that. It's infrastructure, same as business." Jay took a sip of water. "When I look at what happened with Suje at death row, I see what happens when you confuse intimidation with respect, when you think force equals power." Russell nodded, understanding the reference to the cautionary tale of Death Row Records' implosion under Suge Knight's volatile leadership. "The real power," Jay continued, "is in building systems that outlast you, in creating opportunities that multiply without your direct involvement." "You're thinking like an owner, not an artist," Russell observed. "I'm not a businessman," Jay replied, the words forming in his mind with perfect clarity. "I'm a businessman." The recording studio, late night, March 2004. Jay listened to playback of a verse he'd contributed to a track with Memphis Bleak. The line about being a business man hitting differently now that he'd articulated it. The phrase encapsulated his evolving philosophy, the understanding that his greatest product wasn't music but himself, his vision, his ability to create value across domains. Beyonce sat on the couch behind him, reviewing her own notes for an upcoming album. Their relationship had become the center around which both their lives orbited, though they maintained meticulous privacy around it. The partnership was perfect in its complementary nature, her unmatched performance discipline and creative perfectionism balanced by his strategic instinct and business acumen. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, looking up from her notes. Thinking about the next 5 years, he replied. The Def Jam position is teaching me exactly what I thought it would. That you need to be the owner, not the executive. He smiled at how perfectly she understood his mind. Exactly. LA and I respect each other, but we're playing different games. He's building his career, I'm building my empire. So what's the next move? Jay turned away from the mixing board. Build something that's wholly mine. Something that combines music, management, publishing. A full-service shop where artists can grow without giving away their power. Sounds like you've been planning this for a while, she said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Just organizing thoughts that have been there all along. He moved to sit beside her. The foundation is part of it too. Everything connects. The business, the philanthropy, the art. Different expressions of the same vision. Outside, the lights of Manhattan glittered like promises. Inside, two artists at the height of their powers contemplated a future. Neither could fully envision yet, but both somehow knew would exceed even their ambitious imaginations. December 2004. The year was ending with Jay firmly established as Def Jam's president, his first major signings already showing promise. The corporate halls were decorated for the holidays, an executive holiday party in full swing down the corridor from his office. Jay stood at his window, watching the winter darkness settle over the city. The corporate experience had been enlightening, revealing both the power and limitations of traditional music industry structures. He could make decisions here, significant ones, but the true architectural control, the ability to design the very foundation of the business, remained elsewhere. His phone buzzed with a message from Beyonce, "Missing you. Call when you're done." Their relationship had deepened throughout the year, becoming the most significant partnership of his life, professional, creative, and deeply personal. They created a private world together, a sanctuary from the constant scrutiny of public life, where both could simply be themselves rather than the icons they had become. As Jay prepared to join the holiday festivities, he reflected on the year's evolution. The Shawn Carter Foundation was now actively changing lives, providing educational opportunities to students who reminded him of himself at that age, bright, hungry, but constrained by circumstance. Roc-A-Fella continued its expansion, translating cultural currency into commercial success, and his new role at Def Jam was already reshaping the label's direction and energy. Yet he knew this was merely a chapter, not the conclusion. The lessons learned in corporate boardrooms would serve him well in building what would come next. Something owned rather than operated, created rather than inherited. Tomorrow would bring another day of meetings, another round of talent scouting, another set of strategic decisions. But the vision extended far beyond tomorrow, beyond Def Jam, beyond even music itself. Jay had glimpsed the architecture of something larger, a blueprint for translating cultural relevance into enduring influence and wealth. As he stepped out of his office to join the holiday celebration, Jay carried with him the quiet confidence of a man who had discovered not just his voice as an artist, but his vision as a builder. The music that had given him his first language had now given him the platform to create lasting systems of opportunity and change. The snow had begun again outside, fresh flakes erasing the day's footprints, creating a clean slate for tomorrow's journey. Jay welcomed the symbolism as he closed his office door behind him, ready to write the next verse in a story that was growing more complex and ambitious with each passing season. The faint glow of Manhattan's skyline reflected in the black-tinted windows of the Maybach as it glided down the West Side Highway. Jay-Z leaned back against the butter-soft leather, allowing himself a rare moment of contemplation as the driver navigated through the late evening traffic. The year was 2005, and the world still believed he had retired. The Black Album had been positioned as his grand finale, a strategic move that had elevated his mystique to unprecedented levels. Scarcity, he had learned, was its own form of currency, perhaps the most valuable kind. Now, in the quiet sanctuary of his car, he could appreciate how that calculated withdrawal had only heightened demand for his return. Through the tinted glass, the city lights blurred together like a visual jazz composition. His phone buzzed with a message from Beyonce. They had been carefully guarding their relationship from the public's insatiable appetite, moving like shadows between private entrances and secured locations. The discretion wasn't merely for privacy, it was strategic. Together, they understood the power of controlling their own narrative. "Mr. Carter," his driver spoke softly, "we're arriving at the studio." The Maybach pulled up to an unmarked building in Chelsea. Despite his supposed retirement, the creative process had never stopped. Music was in his blood. Retirement was merely a comma, not a period. Inside the studio, the air was cool and still, punctuated only by the soft hum of equipment. Kanye West was hunched over a mixing board, lost in the architecture of sound. Their collaboration had evolved into something more profound than mentor and protege. They were now peers in an industry that was rapidly transforming around them. "You heard what's happening to CD sales?" Kanye asked without looking up, his fingers adjusting levels with surgical precision. "Down almost 30% since 2000. People downloading everything." Jay nodded, absorbing the information. The industry's tectonic plates were shifting. Traditional distribution models were crumbling under the weight of technological change. iTunes had unbundled the album. YouTube was becoming the new MTV. MySpace was connecting artists directly to fans. "That's why we need to think beyond music," Jay replied, settling into a leather chair. "The album is becoming a business card, not the business." His mind was already calculating several moves ahead. While the recording industry fought piracy with lawsuits, he was mapping a different path, one that positioned him at the intersection of art, commerce, and ownership. The windows of the Iconics brand group's Midtown offices offered a panoramic view of a city that seemed oblivious to the economic storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was early 2007, and housing prices had already begun their ominous decline, though few recognized the significance. Jay-Z, however, had developed an instinct for timing that extended beyond music. Across the polished conference table, executives in tailored suits presented projections for Roc-A-Fella, the clothing line he had built with Dame Dash. The numbers were impressive, $700 million in annual retail sales, but Jay wasn't there to celebrate past success. He was there to execute an exit. "We're prepared to offer $204 million, the Iconics CEO stated, "with you retaining creative control and marketing oversight at approximately $1 million annually." Jay's expression revealed nothing, a skill honed in poker games and boardrooms alike. Behind that composed exterior, calculations whirred. The relationship with Dash had deteriorated years earlier, their visions diverging like trains on separate tracks. This sale would sever their last formal business tie, cash out Dash's stake, and, most importantly, provide the liquid capital needed for Jay's next moves. Later that evening, in the penthouse of his apartment, the lights of the city formed a glittering tapestry below. He poured a glass of Armand de Plignac, gold bottle gleaming under soft lighting. He raised it slightly, a private toast to a deal that few outside the business world fully understood. The Roc-A-Fella sale wasn't simply about fashion. It was about timing the market, creating liquidity, and setting the stage for investments in spaces that the old music industry couldn't imagine. His phone rang. It was his attorney. "The paperwork is finalized," the lawyer said. "After splits and taxes, the numbers look good. Exactly what we projected." Jay thanked him and ended the call. The Roc-A-Fella exit would become a case study in leveraging cultural capital into financial capital. The fashion line had served its purpose. Now that capital would be deployed elsewhere, in ventures with even greater upside potential. The offices of Live Nation in Beverly Hills were understated compared to the magnitude of the conversation happening inside. It was early 2008, and the economic indicators were becoming impossible to ignore. Bear Stearns had collapsed in March. Foreclosures were spiking nationwide. Unemployment was creeping upward. Yet here, in this quiet conference room, Jay-Z was negotiating one of the most innovative deals in music business history. 10 years, multiple rights, comprehensive partnership. Michael Rapino, Live Nation's CEO, summarized. Not just recording, but touring, merchandising, publishing, and more. The numbers being discussed, $150 million over the term, represented more than a record contract. This was a platform agreement, a recognition that the album itself was no longer the center of the music universe. Live experiences, once seen as promotional vehicles for album sales, were becoming the primary economic engine. "The world is changing," Jay observed, his voice calm against the backdrop of financial anxiety permeating the wider economy. "People might download music for free, but they can't download the experience." The Live Nation executives nodded. They had the data. While recorded music revenue was plummeting, concert ticket prices and merchandise sales were climbing. Jay-Z had consistently sold out venues, commanding premium prices and attracting sponsorships that amplified revenue beyond ticket sales alone. "This deal also provides the foundation for Roc Nation," Jay continued. "A full-service entertainment company, music, sports, film, television. A true ecosystem." In his mind, he could already see the structure taking shape. Live Nation would provide infrastructure and capital. He would provide the vision, relationships, and cultural navigation. The commission model was elegant: 10 to 20% of music earnings, 3 to 5% of sports contracts, 10 to 20% of endorsements, with potential for 30 to 40% operating margins. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and quiet confidence, Jay stepped out into the California sunshine. His phone buzzed with a message from Beyonce, who was preparing for her upcoming tour. Their wedding plans were taking shape, carefully guarded from public knowledge. In a few months, they would formalize a union that represented more than marriage. It was the beginning of an unprecedented joint trajectory of black wealth creation in America. The September 2008 morning in New York carried an unmistakable tension. Lehman Brothers had filed for bankruptcy the previous day, sending shockwaves through global financial markets. The economy that had seemed merely troubled months earlier was now in freefall. In a newly leased space in Chelsea, the Roc Nation offices were taking shape. While financial institutions collapsed around them, Jay-Z and a small team of executives were building something new, a company structured for the future of entertainment. The traditional labels are cutting staff by the hundreds, Juan Perez, one of Jay's trusted lieutenants, noted as they walked through the space. A&R budgets slashed, marketing departments gutted. Jay nodded, taking in the information without surprise. "They're trying to protect a business model that doesn't exist anymore. We're building one that does." The Roc Nation model was intentionally lean and integrated: artist management, publishing, label services, marketing, and soon sports representation, all under one roof. The economics were straightforward. Roc Nation would take a percentage of what it helped create, aligning incentives with talent rather than extracting value from them. That afternoon, Jay sat alone in his office, reviewing the early roster of artists and the partnership structure with Live Nation. Outside his window, America's financial system was receiving unprecedented government intervention: TARP funds, Federal Reserve programs, emergency measures to prevent total collapse. Yet here, in this quiet space, he was planting seeds in the midst of economic winter. His phone lit up with a message from Beyonce. Their April wedding had been intimate and unpublicized, a remarkable feat in an era of escalating celebrity exposure. Together, they were navigating fame on their own terms, controlling their narratives with the precision of master chess players. The presidential election of November 2008 cast a different light across America. Barack Obama's victory represented a seismic shift in the country's cultural landscape, a moment that resonated deeply with Jay-Z. As he watched the election results from a private viewing party in Manhattan, the historical significance wasn't lost on him. "From Marcy to the White House," someone said, raising a glass. Jay smiled but remained quiet, absorbing the moment. His journey from the Marcy Houses to boardrooms and business empires paralleled a larger American narrative of possibility, but also highlighted the exceptional nature of such mobility. For every success story like his, countless others remained trapped in systems designed to limit their progress. The following week, in Roc Nation's offices, the team was reviewing the early performance metrics of their model. Despite the economic crisis, or perhaps because of it, the integrated approach was showing promise. Traditional music companies were struggling with declining revenue and rising costs. Roc Nation's commission structure meant it grew only when its artists did. The touring data is particularly valuable, noted a business development executive. We know which markets respond to which artists, which price points work, which merchandise sells. That's information the traditional labels never had. Jay nodded. Information asymmetry was power, always had been, from Marcy to Manhattan. Now he was building systems to capture data that could inform every business decision, from tour routing to brand partnerships. And the brands still want access, added another team member. Even in this economy, they need cultural relevance. We control that access. This was the moat around the business relationships and cultural translation that couldn't be easily replicated. Major corporations needed authentic connections to cultural movements. Artists needed revenue beyond struggling album sales. Roc Nation was positioning itself as the essential bridge between these worlds. December 2008 brought a rare moment of reflection. In the penthouse of their Tribeca apartment, Jay-Z and Beyonce hosted an intimate dinner for their closest circle. Outside, New York was transformed by winter snow, softening the hard edges of the city, holiday lights creating momentary warmth against economic chill. The conversation moved between art and business, personal milestones and professional strategies. Unemployment had reached 7.2% nationally and was still climbing. The auto industry was receiving government bailouts. Housing prices continued their relentless decline. Yet within this protected space, a different kind of construction was underway. Roc Nation was establishing its foundation. Their marriage was finding its rhythm. Investments were being positioned for future growth. Later that night, after guests had departed, Jay stood at the window overlooking the city. The snow continued falling, blanketing the streets below in pristine white that would soon be marked by countless footprints. "What are you thinking about?" Beyonce asked, joining him. "The next decade," he replied quietly. "Everything's changing. Music, money, media. I'm thinking about what we build while everyone else is distracted by what's falling apart." She nodded, understanding the weight and possibility of the moment. Together, they had accomplished what few could imagine. Artistic excellence, business acumen, cultural influence, all while maintaining the privacy and integrity that mattered to them both. Outside, the snow continued falling on a city in economic winter. But within the warmth of that space, seeds were being planted for a spring that few could yet envision, a future where artists controlled their own destinies, where cultural capital translated directly to financial capital, and where traditional gatekeepers became increasingly irrelevant. The retirement had been brief, strategic, a comma, not a period. The next chapters were already being written in deals and structures designed not just to navigate the changing landscape, but to reshape it entirely. The White House gleamed in the fall sunshine, a monument to power that had witnessed centuries of American history. Shawn Carter, known to the world as Jay-Z, adjusted his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit as he approached the East Wing entrance. The Secret Service agents recognized him immediately, not as the former hustler from Marcy projects, but as a trusted ally of the President of the United States. It was 2012, and he was here to discuss his upcoming performance at an Ohio rally for Barack Obama's re-election campaign. The relationship between the artist and the president had evolved beyond mere political convenience into something resembling genuine respect. Both men had risen to unprecedented heights from humble beginnings. Both understood the delicate balance of power and perception. "Mr. Carter," said a young aide with practiced poise, "the president will see you shortly." Jay nodded, surveying the room with the quiet calculation that had become second nature. The portraits of former first ladies watched him from gilded frames, silent witnesses to his unlikely presence in these hallowed halls. 4 years ago, when Obama first campaigned, Jay's participation had been considered bold, perhaps even risky. Now it was expected. The world had changed. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Beyonce, "Tell Barack," one said hello. "Love you." He smiled to himself. Their partnership, artistic, romantic, financial, had become the foundation upon which his expanding empire rested. The meeting with Obama was brief but warm. They discussed the upcoming rally, the challenges facing urban communities, and the changing landscape of American politics. There was an ease between them now, a mutual understanding that transcended their different worlds. "You know," Obama said as they concluded, "you've done something remarkable with your platform. Not just entertainment, but building something lasting." Jay nodded. "That's always been the goal, Mr. President, making moves that compound over time." Later that evening, in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons in Georgetown, Jay reviewed the portfolio updates his financial team had sent over. The Samsung deal was taking shape, a revolutionary approach to album distribution that would bypass traditional gatekeepers entirely. The electronics giant was proposing to purchase 1 million copies of his upcoming album, Magna Carta Holy Grail, at $5 each, effectively guaranteeing platinum status before a single consumer downloaded it. Beyond the 5 million payday, it was the principle that intrigued him. Artists had been at the mercy of distributors since the beginning of recorded music. This arrangement inverted the power dynamic. The brand needed his cultural relevance more than he needed their traditional marketing channels. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Washington Monument stood illuminated against the night sky. Jay sipped Armand de Brignac champagne, considering how far the chess pieces had advanced since his first deal with Reebok in 2003, when he'd insisted on equity instead of the standard endorsement fee for the S. Carter sneaker line. That principle, ownership over sponsorship, had become his investment philosophy. His early stake in the Roc-A-Fella clothing line had resulted in a $204 million sale to Iconics in 2007. The Budweiser Select partnership in 2000 had similarly been structured with long-term value creation in mind rather than quick endorsement cash. Now, in 2013, his most exciting investment wasn't even music-related. He'd recently written a check for approximately $2 million to join Uber's Series C funding round. The car service startup was still young, controversial in some circles, but Jay recognized something in its founder, Travis Kalanick, the same disruptive hunger, the same impatience with ossified systems that had driven his own rise. "You're betting on the jockey, not just the horse," his friend Warren Buffett had told him during their lunch in Omaha back in 2010. The Oracle of Omaha's wisdom had profoundly influenced Jay's approach to wealth building. "Price is what you pay, value is what you get," Buffett had said, a simple phrase that resonated deeply with someone who had started with nothing. Their unlikely friendship, the 80-year-old Nebraska investor and the 40-something Brooklyn rapper, had surprised many. But both men recognized in each other a similar clarity about money as a tool rather than an end, about reputation as the ultimate asset class. In his hotel room, Jay removed his Audemars Piguet watch and placed it carefully on the nightstand. His relationship with timepieces had evolved alongside his wealth philosophy. Where gold chains and diamonds had once signified success in the hip-hop world, his current collection of Rolexes, Hublots, and Richard Milles represented something more refined, functional luxury, pieces of engineering excellence rather than mere displays of prosperity. The next morning, Jay joined his longtime business partner and Roc Nation co-founder Jay Brown for breakfast at the hotel. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversation of Washington power brokers, senators, lobbyists, and visiting dignitaries, all conducting the business of influence. "Samsung is ready to sign," Brown said, sliding a folder across the table. "Legal's gone through everything twice." "This is unprecedented, Jay." Jay nodded, reviewing the key points of the agreement. "And the app development? On schedule. Users will download it to their Samsung devices and get the album free 72 hours before the general release." That's the beauty of it," Brown smiled. "They're changing their certification rules. Digital albums will count toward platinum status. We're essentially rewriting the playbook for the streaming era." Jay considered this, stirring his coffee methodically. The recording industry was in the midst of seismic shifts. Spotify had launched in the US in 2011, joining Pandora and YouTube in the battle for streaming dominance. Traditional album sales were declining, and artists everywhere were struggling to adapt to per-stream payments measured in pennies. But where others saw crisis, Jay saw opportunity. The Samsung deal wasn't just about the immediate $5 million. It was about establishing a new paradigm, where artists with sufficient cultural capital could leverage that influence directly with brands, bypassing the traditional label system entirely. What about the Uber investment? Jay asked, changing the subject. Brown's expression turned cautious. It's high risk, high reward. Regulatory hurdles in multiple cities. The taxi commissions are fighting them hard. But the concept is sound, Jay countered. People using their phones to get car service on demand. It's where everything is headed, direct connection, cutting out the middleman. Like the Samsung deal, Brown nodded. Exactly like the Samsung deal. Later that week, back in New York, Jay met with his financial advisors in the sleek midtown offices of Roc Nation. The atmosphere was far from the ostentatious displays of wealth common in many entertainment companies. The design was minimalist, the furniture modern but understated, reflecting Jay's evolved aesthetic sensibilities. His chief investment officer walked him through the diversified portfolio they had built: real estate holdings in Tribeca and Brooklyn, strategic stakes in tech companies like Etsy, the promising position in JetSmarter, a private jet booking service, and various restaurant investments including Buffalo Boss, co-owned with his nephew. The Uber position is obviously speculative, the advisor noted, but if they achieve even half of their projected market penetration, the returns could be extraordinary. Jay nodded, studying the projections. And our stance on endorsements versus equity, maintaining the policy. We're turning down standard endorsement offers unless they include meaningful ownership components. This approach had become the cornerstone of Jay's wealth-building strategy, leveraging his cultural influence to acquire equity rather than one-time payments. It was the same principle he'd applied when negotiating his landmark deal with Live Nation in 2008, worth a reported $150 million. That evening, Jay joined Beyonce and a small group of friends for dinner at Carbone in Greenwich Village. The restaurant had become a favorite among the power elite of New York, the perfect balance of exclusivity and authenticity. As they settled into the private dining room, the conversation flowed between business, politics, and culture. The midterms are going to be tough, noted one guest, a prominent Democratic strategist. The Tea Party momentum hasn't faded as much as we'd hoped. People are still hurting, Jay observed. The recovery hasn't reached everyone. We see it in the neighborhoods we're trying to help. Beyonce added, that's why these education initiatives matter so much. We need to build something sustainable. As the dinner progressed, Jay found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The contrast between the Marcy projects of his youth and this rarefied world of influence and access remained stark in his mind. Yet he had maintained a core authenticity that kept him connected to both worlds, a bridge figure in American culture. After dinner, their driver navigated the Maybach through the glittering Manhattan streets toward their Tribeca loft. Beyonce rested her head on his shoulder, both exhausted from their relentless schedules. The Samsung deal is finally done, he told her quietly. 1 million albums pre-sold. She squeezed his hand. You're changing the game again. As usual. He smiled in the darkness of the car. It's about creating the template. Artists have been taking bad deals for too long. Speaking of deals, she said, did you see what Blue's College Fund has done since we set it up? Their daughter, Blue Ivy, born in January 2012, had already become the center of their universe. Warren's advice, Jay replied. Start early, think long term. The car pulled into their private garage. As they rode the elevator to their penthouse, Jay thought about the conversation with Buffett that had so profoundly shaped his approach to wealth preservation. The investor had emphasized the power of compound interest, the value of patience, and the importance of investing in what you truly understand. For Jay, that meant building an ecosystem around his core strengths, cultural relevance, an understanding of consumer behavior, and an instinct for identifying shifts in taste and technology before they became obvious to others. The next morning, he reviewed the final mock-ups for the Samsung app that would deliver Magna Carta Holy Grail to users. The design was clean, interactive, allowing fans to unlock lyrics and special content as they explored the album. This approach, treating music as an evolving experience rather than a static product, reflected his understanding that in the streaming era, engagement had become as valuable as ownership. The traditional metrics of success were being rewritten, and he was helping to author the new rules. His assistant interrupted with a message. President Obama's team had confirmed his participation in an upcoming fundraiser in New York. Jay acknowledged the information with a nod, another reminder of how his influence now extended well beyond music into politics, technology, and broader cultural conversations. That influence had been methodically cultivated. Each appearance, each investment, each partnership was carefully considered for its long-term impact on his evolving brand. The heavy chains and conspicuous consumption of hip-hop's earlier eras had given way to a more sophisticated display of success, strategic investments, and understated luxury. As summer approached, Jay prepared for the release of Magna Carta Holy Grail. The Samsung deal had generated exactly the industry conversation he'd anticipated. Some critics called it a gimmick. Others recognized it as a brilliant repositioning of artist leverage in the digital economy. On June 16, 2013, during Game 5 of the NBA Finals, the commercial announcing the album and its unprecedented distribution model aired. Samsung Galaxy users would receive the album free on July 4th, 3 days before its official release. The ad itself featured Jay in a recording studio alongside producers Timbaland, Swizz Beatz, Pharrell Williams and Rick Rubin, positioning the project as a serious artistic statement rather than merely a commercial venture. What viewers couldn't see were the complex negotiations that had made this moment possible. The lawyers, the contract revisions, the careful balancing of artistic integrity with commercial innovation. Jay had insisted on maintaining creative control while pioneering a new business model. When the album dropped on July 4th, it was already platinum certified by the Recording Industry Association of America, which had revised its rules to accommodate this new distribution paradigm. The critical reception was mixed, but the business model was undeniably revolutionary. In the aftermath, Jay found himself in conversation with executives from Apple, Google, and Spotify, all suddenly eager to explore similar artist direct distribution models. The gatekeepers of the music industry were being forced to reconsider their role in an ecosystem where artists with sufficient leverage could potentially bypass them entirely. As summer turned to fall, Jay stood in the private viewing room of a Manhattan art gallery, contemplating a Jean-Michel Basquiat canvas. The artist's neo-expressionist work had long resonated with him, another black man who had transformed cultural understanding through raw, uncompromising vision. His phone buzzed with an update from his investment team. Uber's latest valuation had jumped significantly in a new funding round. The $2 million investment was already showing promising returns on paper, though it would be years before the full extent of that decision's wisdom would become clear. Jay studied the Basquiat, seeing in its chaotic brilliance something of his own journey, from the margins to the center, from hustle to institution, from entrepreneur to investor. The painting's seven-figure price tag represented a different kind of value now, not just a luxury purchase, but a store of wealth, an appreciating asset, a legacy item. Like the Samsung deal, like the Uber investment, like his friendship with Warren Buffett and his alliance with Barack Obama, the painting represented a carefully constructed portfolio of influence, wealth, and cultural significance. Each piece connected to the others, creating a diversified empire built on the understanding that, in a changing world, adaptation was not just a survival skill, but the ultimate competitive advantage. As he left the gallery, stepping into the crisp autumn air of Manhattan, Jay carried with him the quiet confidence of the man who had not just succeeded, but had helped redefine what success could mean for himself, for his community, and for the artists who would follow the blueprint he continued to refine with each calculated move. The glass elevator ascended silently, gliding like a crystal bubble through the luxury hotel's central atrium. Inside, The meticulously curated image of the Carter family was about to fracture. It was May 2014, the night of the Met Gala, when New York's most rarefied air became even thinner, breathable only by those who moved through the world as living monuments to success. Shawn Carter stood with perfect stillness in the corner of the elevator, watching as his sister-in-law's composure collapsed into fury. The security footage would later show the world what happened next. Solange lunging, limbs flailing, her rage a storm in a sealed chamber. Beyonce standing with preternatural calm between them, her expression unreadable. And Jay-Z absorbing the blows, never raising a hand in return. When the doors opened, they stepped out with measured poise, faces reset to public perfection. But as they moved through the hotel lobby, he knew something had shifted in the architecture of his life. The surveillance cameras had captured more than an altercation. They had documented the first visible crack in an empire built on control. "Everything is fine," his publicist would say the next day. The statement felt hollow, even as it left his lips. 3 days later, the footage leaked. TMZ splashed it across screens worldwide. The man who had carefully managed his narrative for decades watched as millions dissected a private moment he couldn't edit or reframe. In bedrooms and boardrooms, in barbershops and banking halls, people who had never met him suddenly felt entitled to theorize about the most intimate corners of his life. "The most disrespected person in America is the black woman," Malcolm X had once said. Jay-Z thought about this as he sat in his office at 4040 Club later that week, watching rain streak down the windows of Manhattan. The city lights blurred through the glass, the same way the truth blurred through media speculation. He had built an empire on words, yet found himself uncharacteristically silent. The elevator incident was merely the visible manifestation of deeper fault lines. Like any marriage, theirs had private struggles. Unlike most, theirs would eventually be transmuted into art that millions would consume, analyze, and project upon. In the quiet hours of that spring, as the media storm raged, Jay-Z began to confront questions that success and wealth couldn't answer. Questions about loyalty, vulnerability, the price of ambition, and what it meant to truly build something that would outlast him. Not just a business portfolio, but a legacy that his children, Blue Ivy, not yet 3 years old, could inherit without inheriting its shadows. "Wealth ain't about money," he would later tell the New York Times. "Wealth is about freedom." In 2014, despite a net worth approaching $500 million, he was discovering the constraints that even wealth couldn't dissolve. The winter of 2015 brought another kind of exposure. In March, Jay-Z stood in a Manhattan venue surrounded by music's reigning class. Beyonce, Rihanna, Kanye West, Madonna, Jack White, Alicia Keys, Daft Punk, and others, their expressions solemn as they signed a declaration of artistic independence. The launch of Tidal, the streaming service he had acquired from Swedish company Aspiro for $56 million, was meant to be revolutionary. Artist-owned, high-fidelity, a platform where creators controlled their work. "This is the beginning of a new world," he announced to cameras that broadcast the moment globally. The world responded with skepticism, mockery, and hostility. The image of billionaires and multimillionaires asking fans to pay $19.99 monthly for higher quality audio struck many as tone-deaf in an economy still uneven 6 years. After the Great Recession, tech journalists questioned Tidal's infrastructure compared to Spotify's refined user experience. Music critics wondered if exclusive releases would fragment an already struggling industry. "I failed at Tidal," he admitted to himself one night in his home studio, the words spoken only to the empty room. Failure was not a familiar taste. The company was hemorrhaging money. Reports would later reveal losses approaching $52 million in 2016 alone. Subscriber numbers became contested territory, with Tidal claiming 3 million while industry insiders whispered of far fewer. The celebrity-studded launch, meant to project strength, had instead revealed vulnerability. Standing before his reflection in the darkened control room window, Jay-Z confronted a humbling truth. Celebrity couldn't compensate for technological infrastructure, and wealth couldn't insulate him from miscalculation. The tidal experiment was teaching him what the streets of Brooklyn had taught decades earlier. Adaptation was survival. The platform needed capital, expertise, and patience. The streaming wars were a marathon, not a sprint. In January 2017, Sprint provided a lifeline, investing $200 million for a 33% stake in Tidal. The deal valued the company at $600 million, a paper success that masked the reality of swallowed pride. He had yielded control to preserve the vision. The man who once rapped, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman," was learning that sometimes the business required stepping back. But the Sprint deal bought time and infrastructure. More importantly, it preserved the core principle. Artists deserved ownership stakes in the platforms that distributed their work. The lesson was expensive, but clear revolutionary ideas required not just vision but structural support, not just charisma but institutional patience. "I promised myself I wouldn't let money change me," Jay-Z said quietly to his longtime friend and business partner Tyron "Ty" Smith as they sat in a private dining room at 11 Madison Park in the summer of 2016. Outside, New York sweltered under a heat wave, but inside, the restaurant maintained its perfect climate-controlled elegance. "Has it?" Ty asked, studying his friend's face. "Money didn't, but time does. Perspective does." He paused, turning his water glass slowly. "Becoming a father does." While his business empire faced public turbulence, his personal life had entered even choppier waters. In April 2016, Beyonce had released Lemonade, a visual album that laid bare the infidelities and fractures in their marriage with unflinching artistic precision. Songs like Sorry and Hold Up had transformed private pain into public spectacle, leaving audiences to wonder how much was performance and how much was autobiography. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the messy middle. "I almost lost my family," he said softly, the admission heavy in the climate-controlled air. They had entered therapy together and separately confronting patterns established long before fame had amplified their consequences. For a man who had spent decades constructing a persona of invulnerability, the process was excruciating yet necessary. The therapy sessions forced him to excavate the bedrock of his character, the abandoned child who had learned early that attachment meant vulnerability, that vulnerability invited pain. "Freedom isn't free," his therapist had told him. "The price is honesty with yourself." In 2017, he would transform this reckoning into 444, an album that served as both confession and counterpoint to Lemonade. In tracks like Kill Jay-Z and Family Feud, he would dismantle his own mythology, acknowledging failures that wealth and fame couldn't absolve. The album's title referred to the time he woke up, 4:44 a.m., to write the title track, an explicit apology to his wife. "I apologize, often womanize. Took for my child to be born to see through a woman's eyes," he would rap, the words more vulnerable than any he had previously committed to record. The public narrative shifted. The invincible hustler became the flawed husband seeking redemption. The brand builder became the man wrestling with legacy. It was a commercial risk that proved surprisingly resonant with audiences seeking authenticity in an era of carefully curated social media performances. June 2017 brought renewal. Beyonce delivered twins, a daughter named Rumi and a son named Sir, expanding their family to 5. The Carter household established new rituals, phoneless family dinners where presence couldn't be interrupted by the digital world, morning meditation sessions using the Headspace app, experimental forays into plant-based eating through a 22-day vegan challenge. In his home office, surrounded by art from Basquiat and Cowles, Jay-Z began restructuring not just his business holdings, but his approach to time. The man who had once maintained a punishing schedule of studio sessions, club appearances, and business meetings now blocked sacred hours for family life. The calendar that had once been dominated by acquisition strategies now included Blue Ivy's dance recitals and school events. "The most important investment isn't the next deal," he told his wealth manager during a quarterly review meeting. It's the foundation we're building for my children. This wasn't merely sentiment. Jay-Z had begun serious estate planning, creating structures to transfer wealth efficiently while educating his children about financial literacy. The Shawn Carter Foundation expanded its scholarship programs, focusing on students who might otherwise be excluded from higher education. The reform impulse was taking shape not just in lyrics, but in concrete initiatives. "Nobody wins when the family feuds," he wrote in his notebook one evening, a line that would make its way onto 444. The words contained layers of meaning about his own family, about the hip-hop community, about the broader American family still deeply divided along racial and economic lines. By late 2017, as the Trump administration's first year drove deeper wedges into American society, Jay-Z found himself positioned differently than he had been during the Obama years. No longer the celebrity friend of the president, he became something perhaps more powerful, a cultural elder with the capital and platform to advance specific causes. "You can't have a solution until you start dealing with the problem," he told Van Jones in an interview that fall. "What you reveal, you heal." The revelation was ongoing, both personally and publicly. The healing remained a work in progress. On a crisp November evening in 2017, Jay-Z stood at the window of his Tribeca penthouse, watching the city lights emerge as dusk settled over Manhattan. Behind him, the sound of Beyonce's laughter mixed with Blue Ivy's animated storytelling from the dining room. The twins were asleep, attended by a night nurse in the nursery down the hall. 3 years had passed since the elevator. The surveillance footage that had threatened to define them had instead become merely one note in a complex composition. The tidal turbulence had stabilized with Sprint's investment. The marital crisis had transformed into art that deepened their bond rather than severing it. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, feeling the subtle vibration of the city 16 floors below. The empire remained. The Roc Nation Management Company, the Deza Cognac Partnership, the Armand de Brignac Champagne brand, the real estate holdings, the art collection, the streaming service. But the metrics of success had shifted. His phone buzzed with a message from his meditation coach, reminding him of their session the following morning. Another notification showed a calendar invite for Blue's parent-teacher conference. A third alert displayed market movements affecting his portfolio. With a deliberate motion, he silenced the device and slipped it into his pocket. The business would still be there tomorrow. The markets would still fluctuate. But this moment, this peaceful family evening, was finite and precious. "Daddy, come see what I made," Blue called from the dining room. He turned from the window, from the glittering evidence of his commercial success, towards something more valuable. The billionaire, the artist, the reformed hustler, the husband, the father, all these identities converged in the man who walked toward his daughter's voice. In the gathering darkness beyond the windows, New York continued its relentless pace. Inside, in the warm light of home, Shawn Carter moved at a different rhythm, one measured not in deals closed or albums sold, but in moments truly lived. The soft glow of Manhattan's skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite. Jay-Z stood silently, hands clasped behind his back, his reflection ghosting against the glass. The city below buzzed with its perpetual energy. But up here, 40 stories above the street, a different kind of power hummed, quieter, more deliberate. "You've been staring out that window for 20 minutes, said Alex Spiro, his attorney, organizing documents on the marble conference table. "The NFL contract isn't going to sign itself." Jay turned, his expression measured. "I'm not staring. I'm seeing." The year was 2019, and Shawn Carter was no longer just navigating the music industry. He was reshaping American institutions. The NFL partnership on the table represented more than a business deal. It was an entry point into a system that had long kept people who looked like him on the outside. "They're expecting backlash on this," Alex said, sliding the contract across the polished surface. "The past kneeling quote is already circulating." Jay sighed, picking up the document. "They'll say, I betrayed Kaepernick, that I chose money over the movement." He paused, weighing the papers in his hand. But movements need both pressure from outside and leverage from within. Nobody talks about the second part. The world of 2019 was one of contradictions. Trump's presidency careened from crisis to crisis. The economy boomed while inequality widened. Corporations issued statements about racial justice while their boardrooms remained stubbornly homogeneous. Into this landscape, Jay had positioned himself as something unprecedented, a cultural figure who could access the highest echelons of institutional power without being absorbed by them. 3 months earlier, Forbes had officially declared him hip-hop's first billionaire. The magazine had conducted an asset-by-asset audit: Armand de Brignac Champagne, D'Assé Cognac, Roc Nation, his music catalogue, real estate holdings, art collection, and early investments like his Uber stake. The total exceeded $1 billion, a numerical validation of what he'd been building for decades. The funny thing about being the first billionaire, Jay told Michael Rubin over dinner at Le Bernardin that spring, is that the money itself isn't the point anymore. Rubin, the e-commerce billionaire behind Fanatics, nodded. It's what you do with the access. Exactly. Warren told me that years ago. Jay referred to Warren Buffett, who had become an informal investment mentor. Once you have enough to guarantee your family's security for generations, what matters is how you apply the leverage. That leverage was being directed toward increasingly ambitious targets. The Reform Alliance, which Jay co-founded in 2019 with Meek Mill, Rubin, New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft, and others, wasn't designed as a charity but as a policy machine. Its mission to transform probation and parole addressed a system that trapped millions of Americans, disproportionately black and brown, in cycles of incarceration for technical violations. What makes reform different, Jay explained to David Letterman during their in-depth interview for Netflix's My Next Guest Needs No Introduction in 2018, is that we're not just writing checks, we're writing legislation. By late 2019, reform had helped pass California's AB 1950, which capped probation terms at 1 year for most misdemeanors, and 2 years for felonies, affecting over 200 people annually. The organization employed full-time lobbyists, data analysts, and formerly incarcerated staff members who understood the system from the inside. It's like what we did with music, Jay told his longtime business partner Jay Brown as they reviewed Reform's progress in the Roc Nation offices. We couldn't change the industry by asking permission. We had to build enough power to change the rules. The NFL partnership operated on similar principles, though with more immediate complications. When the announcement came that Roc Nation would become the league's live music entertainment strategist, helping curate Super Bowl halftime shows and social justice initiatives, the reaction was swift and often harsh. "We're past kneeling," Jay had said at the press conference. Those 3 words became a flashpoint. "They're taking it out of context," he told Beyonce that night at their East Hampton estate, his voice tinged with frustration. Kneeling was effective. It raised awareness. Now we need to move towards specific outcomes. Beyonce studied him carefully. "You know they're going to question your motives regardless. The question is whether you can deliver something tangible." The tangible began materializing in February 2020, when Shakira and Jennifer Lopez delivered a halftime show that celebrated Latinx culture with unprecedented boldness, including children in light-up cages, a reference to border detention policies. The following year, The Weeknd's performance continued pushing the envelope of what was possible on America's most watched stage. But the credibility hit was real. Some former allies viewed the NFL deal as a betrayal of Colin Kaepernick and the protest movement. The trade-off, strategic access versus moral clarity, weighed on Jay in quiet moments. "Power concedes nothing without demand," he quoted to Robert Kraft during a reform strategy session in early 2020. Frederick Douglass said that. But sometimes you need people both making demands and inside the room where decisions happen. Then came the pandemic. COVID-19 crashed into American life in March 2020, triggering lockdowns, economic collapse, and a national reckoning with systemic vulnerabilities. By April, unemployment had surged to 14.7%, the highest since the Great Depression. "This changes everything," Jay said during a Zoom meeting with his executive team. The Roc Nation offices stood empty as New York became an epicenter of the first wave. We need to think about what this means for live events, for criminal justice reform when jails are virus hotspots, for all of it. 2 months later, George Floyd's murder under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer ignited global protests. Corporations rushed to issue statements of solidarity. Stakeholder capitalism became the buzzword of boardrooms across America. Watch how many companies suddenly discover Black Lives Matter, Jay remarked to his attorney Alex Spiro with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The question is, what happens when the protests end? Through it all, Jay was reconfiguring his business architecture. Roc Nation, LLC, approximately 75% owned by Jay, 25% by Live Nation, continued expanding its talent management and sports agency divisions. S. Carter Enterprises housed his Spirit's joint ventures. And in 2021, Marcy Venture Partners formalized with approximately $85 million in assets under management, focused on consumer brands and technology companies, where cultural relevance created outsized value. His most significant exit came in March 2021, when he sold a majority stake in Tidal to Block, Incorporated, formerly Square, for approximately $297 million. The streaming service, which he had acquired for roughly $56 million in 2015 and invested perhaps $50 million more into, had achieved an absolute win, nearly tripling the all-in cost, but had dramatically underperformed relative to Spotify's $50+ billion valuation. Tidal taught me something valuable, he told Jack Dorsey, Block's CEO, as they finalized the deal. Artist ownership is necessary, but not sufficient. Distribution platforms need either massive scale or significant subsidy. We couldn't achieve either independently. The Tidal exit, combined with other business activities, made 2021 Jay's best financial year ever, with estimated revenues exceeding $500 million and profits around $400 million. But the pandemic had also clarified priorities. When you can't leave your house for months, he reflected during the Rap Radar podcast in 2017, a conversation that continued to resonate through the lockdown era. You realize which relationships actually matter, which business truly serves your core purpose. On the crisp autumn evening in 2021, as New York began its cautious reopening, Jay hosted a small dinner at the Grill for his closest advisors. They sat at a corner table, the restaurant's mid-century elegance enveloping them in amber light. Jay wore a cream cashmere sweater from Loro Piana, his only adornment a discreet Patek Philippe watch. To survival, he toasted, raising a glass of decisively. To more than survival, corrected Jay Brown, his longest-serving business partner, to building something that outlasts us. Jay nodded. The most important thing we've built isn't on any balance sheet. It's the template, how to convert cultural capital into real capital, and then use both to change systems. Later that night, as his driver navigated the still quiet streets of Manhattan, Jay reflected on the journey from 2018 to that moment. The pandemic had collapsed some opportunities and created others. The social justice movement had accelerated some reforms while revealing how deeply entrenched other problems remained. His wealth had grown to approximately $1.8 billion, according to Forbes' latest estimate. But the true evolution was in his approach to influence. No longer was it enough to succeed within existing structures. Now the ambition was to reform the structures themselves, whether criminal justice, sports leagues, or financial systems. The car pulled up to his Tribeca building. Before stepping out, Jay paused, looking at the empty sidewalks that would soon fill again with the city's relentless energy. The game is still the game, he murmured to himself, but we're changing the rules. The doorman nodded respectfully as Jay entered the lobby, a solitary figure carrying the weight of institutions on shoulders that had once carried only his own survival. The elevator ascended silently into the rarefied air where power resided not in flash or proclamation, but in the quiet architecture of change. The French crystal flute caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the polished conference table. Jay-Z turned the Diocese cognac bottle in his hands, examining its facets with the quiet contemplation of a jeweler assessing a rare stone. Outside, the Manhattan skyline stretched like a steel and glass kingdom, indifferent to the negotiations that had consumed his last several months. "So we've settled," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of both victory and compromise. The lawsuit with Bacardi over Diocese had been resolved after months of valuation disputes and governance questions, exact terms undisclosed to the public, but satisfactory enough that the ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. His longtime confidant, Jay Brown, nodded, sliding a folder of documents across the table. "Terms are final. Your stake value lands where we expected, north of $250 million. Not quite the $750 they offered in 2021, but more aligned with the true value." Silence settled between them, comfortable as old friends who had traversed decades together. The cognac brand represented more than just luxury spirits. It was a vessel of transformation, from consumption to ownership, from culture to capital. Jay took a measured sip from his glass, savoring the amber liquid's complexity. "First Diocese, now closing the LVMH deal on Armand," Jay Brown continued, referencing the 50% acquisition of Jay's champagne brand by the luxury conglomerate. "Bernard's people finalized the numbers last week. Total valuation lands between $600 million and $1.2 billion. Your half sits around $500 to $600 million. Jay-Z's eyes narrowed slightly. "It was never about the exit. It's about building something permanent. The LVMH partnership with Armand de Brignac, Ace of Spades, to those who followed his career, represented more than financial windfall. It was historical placement, a black entrepreneur's brand housed within the world's most powerful luxury consortium." Through the windows, spring sunlight bathed the city in golden hues. The pandemic's most brutal phase had receded, but 2022's economic landscape remained precarious, inflation surging past 9%, the Fed hiking interest rates aggressively, tech stocks cratering. Yet from this vantage point, 36 floors above street level, the turmoil seemed distant, theoretical. "Balance sheet update," Jay Brown said, sliding another document forward. "Current mix, operating businesses at 45 to 50% of total holdings. Catalog at 15 to 20. Art collection between 5 and 8%. The latest Basquiat acquisition pushed you just over $70 million there. Real estate holding steady at 10 to 12% between Bel Air and the Hamptons property. Public equities and alternatives at 15 to 18%. Keeping about 5% liquid." Jay nodded, absorbing the portfolio allocation without comment. His 2024 revenue projections showed approximately $120 to $150 million in run rate revenue, with profits approaching $80 to $100 million annually. Numbers that would have seemed fantastical to the young man from Marcy Projects who once sold his CDs from the trunk of a car. "Desiree called," Jay Brown continued, referring to Desiree Perez, CEO of Roc Nation. "Wanted to confirm you'll be at the quarterly review next Tuesday. The team's grown to 300 now. 60 artists on the roster." "I'll be there," Jay replied. Roc Nation had evolved from fledgling management company to cultural institution, representing everyone from Rihanna and J. Cole to Megan Thee Stallion and DJ Khaled. The sports division had become equally formidable, a testament to patience and strategic expansion. Later that evening, the Bel Air compound stood illuminated against the darkening California sky, its modern lines forming a protective boundary between public and private worlds. At $88 million, the 3,000-square-foot residence represented not just shelter but sanctuary space, to think, create, and simply exist away from the constant scrutiny of public life. Beyonce moved through the minimalist living area, her presence transforming the architectural showcase into something warmer, more intimate. "Blue's asking about the Basquiat again," she said with amusement, referring to their eldest daughter's growing interest in their art collection. "I think we might have an art historian in the making." Jay smiled, genuine warmth replacing the calculated restraint he maintained in business settings. Their collection works by Basquiat, Warhol, Koons, and emerging black artists like Derek Adams and Chabalala Self represented both cultural capital and legacy building. At an estimated $70 to $100 million, it was a significant part of their wealth preservation strategy, but more importantly, a tangible connection to creative lineage. "She can write her thesis on it someday," he replied, settling into a custom-designed chair that managed to be both aesthetically perfect and surprisingly comfortable. Through the windows, Los Angeles sprawled beneath them, a galaxy of lights reaching toward the Pacific. The primary residence choice meant a 13.3% state tax burden on top of the 37% federal rate, a known cost of California living that their financial advisors periodically questioned. Hakeem called, Beyonce mentioned, referring to Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, wanted to discuss the educational initiative for the foundation. The Shawn Carter Foundation had become an increasingly sophisticated philanthropic vehicle, balancing direct impact with the tax advantages of charitable deductions. Similarly, his work with the Reform Alliance focused on probation and parole reform, applying business acumen to systemic problems. "I'll call him tomorrow," Jay replied. After the NFL meeting, his partnership with the NFL remained a point of contention in some circles, with critics arguing he had sold out the culture by engaging with an organization that had blackballed Colin Kaepernick. The reality, as always, was more complex, a strategic calculation that influence from within might yield greater change than protest from without. Morning arrived with the persistent buzz of his secure phone. Ty Smith, another longtime confidant in his inner circle, was calling with updates on their latest opportunity zone. Investments, tax-advantaged development projects in economically distressed communities that aligned profit motive with community impact. "The Baltimore project breaks ground next month," Ty explained, "and the portfolio's performing exactly as projected. Capital gains treatment instead of ordinary income, plus the social impact metrics are exceeding expectations." After the call, Jay descended to his home studio, where platinum plaques provided a visual reminder of his catalog's enduring value, approximately 55 million albums sold in the US. 140 million worldwide. Unlike many artists who had sold their catalogs during the recent valuation boom, Jay had maintained ownership of his masters, a decision that yielded both financial returns and creative control. "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman," he had famously declared years earlier on Kanye West's Diamonds from Sierra Leone remix. The line had become shorthand for his approach, but missed the deeper philosophy, ownership as both economic strategy and radical self-determination. A text message from his financial advisor alerted him to turbulence in tech stocks, another reminder of his deliberate portfolio construction. Unlike earlier in his career, Jay now maintained a relatively conservative allocation to public equities, preferring operating businesses, hard assets like art and real estate, and strategic stakes in private companies. This approach minimized volatility while maximizing control wealth, structured for generational durability rather than quarterly statements. That afternoon, a discreet town car delivered him to a private airfield where his jet waited for the cross-country flight to New York. His fashion choices reflected his current aesthetic, understated luxury from designers like the Roe and Brunello Cucinelli, a vintage Patek Philippe Nautilus on his wrist. Unlike his earlier years, cars had become functional rather than focal transportation, not statement. During the flight, he reviewed the latest Marcy Venture Partners deal flow. The venture fund, named for the housing project where he grew up, had become a vehicle for identifying emerging consumer brands and technologies. More importantly, it created pathways for entrepreneurs who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional venture capital. New York greeted him with its particular energy, frenetic yet familiar, the backdrop against which his empire had first taken shape. His penthouse in Tribeca had been sold the previous year, but the city remained a gravitational center, the place where Roc Nation's headquarters stood as testament to institutional permanence. The following morning's meeting gathered his core team, Jay Brown, Desiree Perez, who had received a pardon in 2021, closing a difficult chapter from her past, and Ty Smith. The conference room walls displayed framed artifacts of their journey. Contracts, photographs, album art, physical reminders of intangible value built over decades. LVMH integration is proceeding exactly as planned, Desiree reported. Their distribution channels are already expanding Ace's presence in Asian markets. First quarter numbers exceeded projections by 12%. Jay nodded, satisfaction evident but restrained. The partnership represented a delicate balance, leveraging LVMH's global infrastructure while maintaining the brand's cultural authenticity. In a world where luxury was increasingly defined by story as much as substance, this narrative alignment was crucial. The diocese settlement has stabilized that relationship too, Jay Brown added. Combined Spirits' portfolio is now valued between 50 million and $1 billion. That's approximately 25% of your total net worth in just the alcohol vertical. A brief silence followed as the implications settled. From Brooklyn to boardrooms, from selling grams to selling champagne, the trajectory would have seemed implausible to anyone who hadn't witnessed each incremental step of the journey. What matters isn't the number, Jay said finally. It's what the number represents. Freedom to operate, freedom to choose, freedom to build what hasn't existed before. The words echoed a sentiment he had expressed in a 2017 interview. Wealth is freedom, not consumption or status, but the ability to determine one's own path, to create opportunity for others, to transcend constraints imposed by systems never designed for your success. Later that week, he walked through a private viewing at a Manhattan gallery, considering works by emerging artists for both personal acquisition and foundation support. His collection had evolved from trophy pieces to thoughtful curation. Basquiat and Warhol alongside rising talents, particularly black artists whose work resonated with his own experience and vision. The gallerist pointed out a powerful piece by a young painter from Chicago. This artist just secured her first museum show. Your support could be transformative. Jay studied the canvas, seeing beyond its aesthetic appeal to its potential impact, how his endorsement might redirect attention and capital toward voices historically excluded from fine arts ecosystem. The decision to purchase wasn't merely transactional but strategic, part of a broader effort to reshape cultural hierarchies. The following evening found him in a private dining room at Carbone, surrounded by the small circle of confidants who had weathered decades alongside him. The conversation flowed easily between business strategy and family updates, world events and industry gossip. The boundaries between personal and professional long since dissolved. To sovereignty, Jay Brown proposed, raising a glass of Armand de Bréguin. The toast captured everything unsaid. How ownership had become both means and end, how control of distribution channels had always mattered more than momentary spotlight, how patience had proven more valuable than immediate gratification. To what's next? Jay replied, completing the exchange. Outside, Manhattan continued its perpetual motion, indifferent to individual ambitions yet shaped by their collective force. The economic anxieties of 2022, 2024, inflation, interest rates, political polarization, technological disruption, created both threat and opportunity, depending on one's position and perspective. From his vantage point, the landscape appeared not as crisis, but as context. Another set of conditions to navigate, another proof point for strategies decades in the making. The empire he had built was not fragile but adaptive, not dependent on any single revenue stream or cultural moment. As midnight approached, he stood at the window of his hotel suite, looking out at the city that had first shaped him. In the glass reflection, he caught a glimpse of his own face, older now, wisdom accumulated in the lines around his eyes, success evident in the relaxed set of his shoulders. "I'm a businessman," he had declared years ago. Now, in the quiet reflection of accomplished ambition, the statement required no repetition. The numbers spoke for themselves. Operating businesses at nearly half his portfolio, catalog value approaching $500 million, art collection growing both financially and culturally, strategic real estate holdings, and carefully balanced investment allocations. The empire was no longer being built. It had been built. What remained was refinement, protection, and the careful consideration of legacy. Not just wealth to be transferred, but wisdom to be imparted, systems to be reformed, opportunities to be created. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more decisions, more strategic calculations. But tonight, in the silence of achievement, there was simply the acknowledgement of distance traveled, from Marcy to LVMH, from outsider to institution, from consuming luxury to defining it. The year was 2025, and Jay-Z stood silently at the window of his Manhattan office, watching the city lights glimmer against the twilight sky. 55 years old now, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had not only built an empire, but had carefully engineered its architecture to withstand the test of time. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a contemplative gaze under a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. The world outside was in transition. A new administration had taken residence in Washington after the contentious 2024 election. Wall Street was cautiously navigating the Federal Reserve's latest moves. And throughout the economy, artificial intelligence was reshaping industries with the same relentless force that the internet had brought 2 decades earlier. But Jay-Z's mind was elsewhere, focused on blueprints of a different kind. We're looking at a 30% growth projection for Armand de Brignac in Asian markets next year, said Desiree Perez, Roc Nation's CEO, as she spread several documents across, the polished mahogany conference table behind him. The LVMH distribution channels are performing beyond our initial estimates. Jay turned from the window. And Diaz. Steady climb since the settlement. The ready-to-drink cocktail line is testing well with millennials. Bacardi wants to expand the partnership into 3 new expressions by 2026. He nodded, taking a seat at the head of the table. The spirits portfolio had become the cornerstone of his wealth strategy, high-margin luxury products with strong distribution moats. The 50% stake in Armand de Brignac, even after the LVMH partnership, represented over $500 million of his net worth. The Diza cognac line, despite the previous legal battle with Bacardi that had settled in 2023, remained a steady performer. What about Monogram? He asked, referring to his premium cannabis brand. Jay Brown, his longtime business partner and Roc Nation's president, scrolled through his tablet. California numbers are strong. We're positioned for federal legalization if it happens in the next administration. The premium positioning is paying off, margins holding at 62%. Jay-Z's philosophy had crystallized over the years. Ownership, not access. Equity, not fees. Margins, not volume. Every business decision now filtered through this prism. The conference room door opened, and the young analyst entered, carrying additional reports. Jay-Z recognized him as Shawn Carter Foundation scholar from the 2018 cohort who had graduated from Howard and joined Roc Nation's Business Affairs Division last year. The foundation had supported over 2,000 students by now, with a graduation rate that significantly outpaced the national average for first-generation college students. "The catalog valuation report, sir," the young man said, placing a bound document on the table. "Thank you, Marcus," Jay-Z replied, making brief but meaningful eye contact, the kind that acknowledged their shared journey from different starting points to this rarefied air. After Marcus exited, Jay opened the report. Music catalogs had become a fascinating asset class, a form of intellectual property that generated annuity like returns in the streaming era. His own catalog, methodically retained and expanded since the 1990s, now represented somewhere between $400 and $500 million in value. "We've got offers to securitize portions of the catalog," Jay Brown noted. "Similar to what Bowie did back in the day, but more sophisticated structures now." Jay-Z closed the report. "Let's hold. Let's hold. We only sell what we can replace with something of greater value. The catalog's not just money, it's leverage." Desiree nodded in agreement. Speaking of leverage, the NFL partnership continues to evolve. The halftime show curation has transformed the performance platform. Ratings up 17% over the 5-year average before our involvement. The NFL collaboration had been controversial when announced in 2019. Critics had called it a betrayal of Colin Kaepernick and the protest movement. But Jay-Z had taken the long view changing systems from within required access and influence. Now, with several years of demonstrable impact, the narrative had shifted. And reform? He asked, referring to the criminal justice reform organization he had co-founded. 15 states with legislative wins, Desiree replied. The probation reform package in California alone is impacting over 200,000 people annually. 40% of our staff are formerly incarcerated individuals. We're moving the policy needle. Jay-Z's philanthropic approach mirrored his business strategy: targeted, leveraged, sustainable. Policy over charity. Systems change over symbolic gestures. His phone vibrated with a text from Beyonce, home by 7 for dinner? Kids want to show you something. He typed a simple reply, on my way at 6:30. Family dinner remained sacred, phoneless, present, focused. Despite their separate business empires, he and Beyonce had developed a synergistic approach to both commerce and parenting. Their eldest, Blue Ivy, had already demonstrated her creative inheritance, becoming a Grammy winner at 9 years old in 2021. The twins, Rumi and Sir, were showing their own distinct personalities at 8. Last item, Jay Brown said, sliding over a prospectus. Marcy Ventures Partners has a potential Series B investment opportunity. Black-owned luxury hotel concept with proprietary booking technology. 28% projected IRR. Founder has proven exit experience from her last startup. Jay-Z examined the materials with practiced efficiency. His venture capital firm, named after the housing project where he grew up, filtered investment opportunities through a specific lens: cultural relevance, significant equity percentages, healthy margins, and founder quality. He avoided heavy tech infrastructure plays after the Tidal experience had demonstrated the challenges of competing in that arena. Set up the founder meeting for next week, he decided, and have the team run the customer acquisition cost projections again. The numbers look optimistic. As the meeting concluded, Jay-Z's CFO lingered. We should discuss the succession planning documents for Roc Nation, she said quietly. The board is asking for updates on the governance structure. Jay nodded. It was the unseen part of the empire. The trusts, the estate planning, the succession architecture designed to preserve wealth across generations. For a man who had once lived check to check, the responsibility of intergenerational wealth transfer was both profound and sometimes surreal. Schedule time next week, he replied, and bring the updated cap tables for the entities. Later that evening, Jay-Z's driver navigated through Manhattan traffic toward home. He gazed out at the city that had shaped him, now transformed by luxury developments and climate adaptation infrastructure. The driver had the radio tuned to a business news station discussing the latest market movements. Federal Reserve signals steady approach to rates through 2026, the announcer stated. Meanwhile, streaming platforms continue consolidation talks, with analysts predicting 3 major players will control 60% of the market by decade's end. Jay-Z's thoughts drifted to his streaming experience with Tidal, ambitious, but ultimately unable to compete with the tech giants. He had sold the platform to Square Now Block in 2021, turning a technological challenge into a strategic exit. The lesson had been valuable: know when to build, when to partner, and when to sell. His phone vibrated again, this time with a notification about Reform Alliance's latest legislative victory in Georgia. The organization had become an effective vehicle for his social impact vision, focusing on measurable outcomes rather than symbolic gestures. When he arrived home, the Manhattan penthouse was filled with the aroma of cooking and the distant sounds of children's laughter. He removed his watch, an understated timepiece worth more than his first recording advance, and placed it in a dish by the entrance. Beyonce greeted him with a kiss. At 53, she remained a cultural force and business powerhouse in her own right. Their partnership had evolved into a complex harmony of separate and joint ventures, personal and professional growth. The children had been working on something all afternoon, she said with a smile. Very secretive. Looking forward to it, he replied, loosening his tie. Dinner was a family affair. Plant-based options alongside traditional favorites, conversations about school projects, world events simplified for young ears, and gentle reminders about table manners. No phones, no assistants, no business calls. This space remained sacrosanct. After dinner, the children presented their surprise, a short film they had created using AI tools and editing software. Blue Ivy had directed, Rumi had written the story, and Sir had composed a simple melody using digital production software. That would have seemed magical to the young Shawn Carter from Marcy Houses. "What do you think, Dad?" Blue Ivy asked, her confidence tempered with a genuine desire for his approval. "I think you've got vision," he replied thoughtfully. "The story has layers. The music complements without overwhelming. You're building something authentic." Later, after the children had gone to bed, Jay-Z sat in his home office reviewing the final details of a new partnership between his premium cannabis brand Monogram and a medical research initiative studying cannabis efficacy for specific health conditions. The contract included equity stakes rather than licensing fees, a non-negotiable element of his business approach. Beyonce joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Busy day?" "Productive," he replied, accepting the steaming cup. Thinking about the long game, she settled into the chair opposite him. "The foundation gala is next month. We should finalize the scholarship expansion announcement." The Shawn Carter Foundation had evolved into a significant educational force, providing not just financial support but mentorship and career placement for students from underserved communities. The foundation's impact was measured not in dollars granted, but in graduation rates and career trajectories. "I want to double the scholarship fund," he said after a moment, "and launch the HBCU initiative we discussed." They talked for another hour about business, family, art collections, and the complex world their children would inherit. Their conversation had the easy rhythm of partners who had weathered storms together and built something enduring in the process. Before bed, Jay-Z spent 30 minutes reading a biography of a 20th century industrialist who had transformed his wealth into lasting institutions. His reading habits had become more deliberate over the years, focused on legacy builders and systems thinkers. The next morning began as most did, a 6 a.m. wake-up, meditation using the Headspace app, followed by a workout with his trainer. His discipline had intensified with age, the recognition that physical and mental clarity were foundations for everything else. At his office by 8:30, he found Tai, one of his oldest friends and business associates, waiting with coffee and a concerned expression. "What's wrong?" Jay-Z asked, immediately noting the unusual tension. "One of our artists is considering an offer from Universal. Better advance, comparable points. They're coming after our roster." Jay-Z took the coffee, unfazed. "Which artist? Which artist?" Tai named a promising rapper who had joined Roc Nation 3 years earlier. "Schedule time with them directly, not through management," Jay-Z replied. "This isn't about money, it's about vision. We need to show them the ecosystem, not just the contract." This was the essence of the Roc Nation platform, not merely a service provider, but an architecture for career building. The company had expanded methodically from music into sports representation, television and film production, and venture investments. By midday, Jay-Z was reviewing the quarterly performance of his spirits portfolio. The luxury sector remained resilient despite broader economic fluctuations. High-end consumers continued consuming, even as the middle market compressed. "The new Deezer Reserve expression needs to launch by holiday season," he instructed his product team. "And I want to revisit the Armand de Brignac packaging for the Asian market expansion. Subtle adaptations, nothing that compromises the core identity." His attention to detail remained sharp, the understanding that luxury was experiential, not merely transactional. Every touchpoint mattered. A notification appeared on his tablet. The Reform Alliance team had secured a meeting with the new administration's Justice Department leadership to discuss federal probation reform. The organization had become adept at building bipartisan coalitions, focusing on the economic and social benefits of reducing recidivism rather than ideological arguments. As evening approached, Jay-Z stood once again at his office window. The city lights were beginning their nightly emergence, creating a tapestry against the darkening sky. His empire was no longer about accumulation but architecture, building systems, platforms, and legacies designed to outlast him. His wealth had transcended numbers on a balance sheet. The Forbes estimates placed his net worth around $2.5 billion in 2024, but the true measure was in the durability of what he had built. Businesses that generated sustainable returns, a foundation that transformed lives, policy initiatives that reformed systems, and a family prepared to carry forward a multi-generational vision. The young hustler from Marcy had become the architect of institutions. The reasonable doubt had yielded to reasonable success, and eventually to a profound understanding. True freedom came through ownership, and lasting impact required building beyond the self. As he gathered his things to head home for another family dinner, Jay-Z reflected on the journey and the road ahead. The empire was not complete. It was evolving, adapting, expanding in deliberate directions. The next chapter would be written not just in balance sheets and business deals, but in lives changed, systems reformed, and opportunities created. In the elevator down to the lobby, he exchanged nods with a maintenance worker, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Between two men separated by circumstance, but connected by the city that had shaped them both. It was a reminder of where he had come from and why the journey forward mattered. Outside, his driver held the car door open. The evening air carried the complex perfume of the city, ambition, struggle, possibility. Jay-Z stepped into the vehicle, his mind already mapping the architecture of tomorrow. From Marcy projects to multi-billion-dollar boardrooms, Jay-Z showed the world that your past doesn't define your limits. He built more than a brand. He built a legacy of ownership, discipline, and vision. Because wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you create and what lasts when you're gone. If Jay-Z's story inspired you tonight, hit subscribe, share this video with someone chasing their dream, and tell us your thoughts about the story and life of Jay-Z in the comments. Until next time, this is Richie Rich Stories. Stay inspired, stay building,